Section 1. The World That Refuses to Make Sense. There is a house on Spooner Street that has burned down, exploded, been flooded, invaded by foreign governments, torn apart by time paradoxes, visited by the literal Grim Reaper, and somehow still sits at the same address every single week, looking exactly the same as it always has. The lawn is the same, the furniture is the same, the people inside it are the same, and none of them ever seem too troubled by what happened last Tuesday. That house belongs to the Griffin family, and the world surrounding it is one of the most quietly bizarre, deeply strange, and genuinely unsettling fictional universes ever put on television. Not because of the jokes, not because of the crude humor or the cutaway gags, but because if you look closely, really closely, at what the show has built over more than 2 decades of episodes, you start to notice that the foundation of this world is riddled with questions that nobody has ever answered, contradictions that nobody has ever explained, dark corners in the lore that the show walked into once and then quietly tiptoed away from, hoping nobody noticed. But somebody noticed. This is a deep, slow, comfortable exploration of every major mystery, fan theory, lore inconsistency, and unanswered question buried inside the Family Guy universe. We are going to move through this world like detectives walking through a crime scene. No rush, no skip. Every corner gets examined. Every strange detail gets pulled out into the light and turned over in our hands. Some of what we find will be funny. Some of it will be surprisingly dark. Some of it will make you look at characters you have spent years watching in a completely different way. We are starting from the very beginning, from the pilot episode that first introduced this family and this strange little fictional town, and we are going to work our way forward through every decade of episodes, every retcon, every plot hole, every haunting detail that was introduced once and never mentioned again, and every theory that the community has built up around the gaps. So, get comfortable. Make yourself at home. Put on something warm. Settle into wherever you are right now, and let's step into one of the most fascinating and underexamined fictional universes in the history of animation. Because the house on Spooner Street has a lot of secrets. And tonight, we are going to find every single one of them. Hey, before we get into Section 2, drop a comment and let me know where in the world you are watching from right now and what time it is. There is something really wonderful about knowing this video is traveling out there to so many different places, different time zones, different corners of the world. Tell me your city or your country, and if you haven't subscribed yet, go ahead and do that now. It costs nothing and it genuinely helps the channel grow. Okay? Let's keep going. Section 2. The Griffin Family Timeline. A history that keeps rewriting itself. Let us start with the foundation, the Griffin family. Peter, Lois, Meg, Chris, Stewie, and Brian. These 6 characters have been the center of the show since the 31st of January, 1999. When the pilot first aired after Super Bowl 33 and pulled in around 22 million viewers in a single night. Over the decades since, the show has built up an enormous amount of backstory for these characters. Flashbacks, retcons, contradictions, revelations, and revelations that contradict earlier revelations. The result is a family history that, when you try to assemble it into a single coherent narrative, simply refuses to hold together. It contradicts itself in ways both large and small. And the question worth asking is whether those contradictions are just the result of sloppy writing in a long-running comedy show, or whether they point to something stranger and more interesting about the nature of this fictional universe. Let us start with Peter Griffin, because Peter's history is arguably the most broken timeline in the entire show. Peter Leuven Griffin was born in Mexico. That much was established in the episode Padre de Familia, which revealed that Thelma Griffin, Peter's mother, had traveled to Mexico to get an abortion and ended up giving birth there instead when the procedure was deemed too dangerous to perform. Peter was technically born in Mexico, which in that episode becomes a major plot point when it is discovered that he is not legally a United States citizen. But here is where it starts to unravel. In many earlier episodes, Peter's American upbringing in Rhode Island is treated as completely settled fact, with no hint of any foreign birth or immigration status. His childhood memories consistently show him growing up in New England, attending American schools, being raised in an American household. None of these memories include anything that would suggest he arrived in the United States from another country. The citizenship revelation seems to come from nowhere. Then there is the matter of who raised him. Francis Griffin, the man Peter called his father for most of his life, was a deeply devout Catholic man who spent years being the source of intense guilt and religious pressure in Peter's life. Their relationship was complicated, frequently painful, and filled with Francis's disappointment in his son's failures. In Peter's Two Dads, which aired in season 5, Francis is accidentally killed during Meg's birthday party when Peter falls down the stairs on a unicycle and crushes him. As Peter grieves and begins therapy, a buried memory surfaces. Francis, in Peter's mind, is saying clearly, "I'm not your father." And so Peter travels to Ireland to find his biological father, a man named Mickey McFinnigan, who turns out to be the town drunk in a small Irish village, a cheerful, ruddy-faced alcoholic who looks remarkably similar to Peter in both body shape and general temperament. This revelation raises a genuinely interesting question that the show never seriously grapples with. If Peter is descended from the McFinnigan bloodline, not the Griffin bloodline, then what does that mean for all of the other Griffin ancestors that the show has referenced over the years? The most significant of these is Nate Griffin, the enslaved ancestor who appears in the episode Peter Griffin, Husband, Father, Brother. Nate Griffin is presented as one of Peter's ancestors, with the entire episode built around Peter discovering that his family has a history of slavery on one side and slave ownership on the Pewterschmidt side. It's a major piece of the show's lore, but if Peter is not biologically a Griffin at all, then Nate Griffin is not his ancestor. The entire genetic and historical connection falls apart. The show is aware of this problem in a passing, almost embarrassed way. A note in the TV Tropes analysis of the episode quietly points out that Nate Griffin cannot be Peter's ancestor given the McFinnigan revelation, while noting that the McFinnigan and Griffin families might share a common ancestor given how similar they look. But this is fan speculation filling a hole that the writers simply left open. Then there is the question of Peter's age, and when certain events in his life happened. The show's timeline has been called elastic, and that is generous. Peter is stated to be 42 or 43 years old in the early seasons. Lois is around the same age. And yet the flashbacks to their early lives keep shifting, placing certain events in different decades depending on what joke the writers want to make. In one episode, a flashback places teenage Peter in the late 1970s. In another, he is a teenager in the mid-1980s. In yet another, events from his childhood seem to take place in the early 1990s. There is no internal consistency to when these characters were actually born or came of age. The show uses whatever decade is funniest for the cultural reference it wants to make, and continuity takes a back seat. This creates genuinely surreal moments when you try to do the math. If Peter was in high school in the 1970s, he would be well into his 50s by the time the show starts. If his teenage years were in the late 1980s, he would be in his early 30s when Meg was born, which actually tracks better with his stated age of 43. But then later flashbacks push things in a different direction again, and the math stops adding up no matter how you run it. Lois's history is similarly complicated, though it tends to be more internally consistent than Peter's, at least in the earlier seasons. What the show does establish clearly is that Lois comes from an extraordinarily wealthy family, the Pewterschmidts, and that her decision to marry Peter was considered a form of social catastrophe by her parents, particularly her father Carter. Carter Pewterschmidt, voiced by Seth MacFarlane, is one of the most quietly menacing characters in the show's history. He is presented as a conservative billionaire who holds the kind of power that affects whole communities, and he uses it without moral hesitation. There is the notorious episode where Brian and Stewie discover that Carter's pharmaceutical company has been hiding a cure for cancer from the public simply because treating cancer is more profitable than curing it. This revelation is treated as a dark joke, a passing moment of corporate villainy, and then the show moves on. But it deserves more attention than that, and we will come back to it in a later section when we talk about the shadow forces operating behind the surface of this town. What we should note here is that Lois's backstory contains its own significant gap. She has a brother named Patrick who was institutionalized, kept in an asylum for years because of behavior that Carter found embarrassing. When Patrick eventually escapes, it is revealed that he has become a serial killer. This is one of the darkest revelations in the entire show's history, and like many dark revelations in this universe, it gets resolved quickly and then mostly dropped. The implication that Carter effectively created a serial killer by hiding his son away rather than getting him proper help is enormous. It says something genuinely chilling about the Pewterschmidt family's relationship with power and control. But the show never goes back to fully explore what it means for Lois, for the family, or for our understanding of Carter as a character. Then there is the matter of Meg's biological parentage. In the episode Screwed the Pooch, Peter is asking Brian questions to prove that Brian knows the Griffin family well enough to be considered a loyal member of the household. One of the questions is about Meg. Brian correctly identifies that Peter is not Meg's biological father. The man who fathered Meg is named Stan Thompson. This revelation is stated plainly, confirmed within the episode, and then almost never seriously followed up on. Stan Thompson appears in the show much later as a truck driver who briefly interacts with Meg when she tracks him down, wanting some kind of connection with her biological father. The meeting goes badly. Stan Thompson is not interested in a relationship with the daughter he apparently fathered and then had no part in raising. What is never explained is the full context of how Stan Thompson came to be Meg's biological father. The show implies that Lois had a relationship or encounter with him before or during the early period of her marriage to Peter. The details are murky, and the show has treated this information inconsistently. In some episodes, Peter behaves as though Meg is fully his daughter, with no acknowledgement of the Thompson revelation. In others, the distance and contempt he shows toward Meg feels like it might be connected to his knowledge that she is not biologically his, though the show never quite commits to that reading. The age of the Griffin children is another timeline puzzle that is impossible to resolve logically. Meg is a teenager, somewhere between 16 and 18 throughout most of the show's run. Chris is slightly younger, around 13 to 14. Stewie is consistently identified as 1-year-old. Yet the show has been running for over 2 decades and none of them age. Time moves at a strange and inconsistent pace in this universe. Where seasons and years go by in the narrative, characters celebrate multiple birthdays, and yet the fundamental ages of the core cast remain essentially frozen. This is standard for animated comedy, of course. The Simpsons has had the same children for an even longer period without aging them. But Family Guy makes a unique choice in occasionally acknowledging the passage of real-world time directly, referencing current events and political figures in ways that anchor specific episodes to specific years, while the characters themselves remain static. The result is a timeline that cannot be taken seriously as a literal record of events, but instead functions more like a collection of possible moments happening in some loosely defined eternal present. And that, interestingly, is exactly what one of the most popular theories about this universe argues. The multiverse theory, which the show itself introduced and then never fully explained, suggests that these contradictions are not errors at all. They are evidence. Evidence that the world of Family Guy is not a single continuous universe, but a shifting, overlapping collection of realities in which the same family exists in slightly different versions. The Peter who grew up in the 1970s and the Peter who grew up in the 1980s are not the same Peter. They are parallel versions, and the show moves between them without announcement. It is a compelling idea, and we will explore it in much more depth when we get to the section on the multiverse. But before we can fully understand the multiverse theory, we need to spend some time with the most mysterious and perplexing member of the Griffin family. A man who may not be entirely human, a man whose behavior has shifted so dramatically over the course of the show that some fans have argued he cannot be one single consistent person. The man at the center of this whole strange world, Peter Griffin. Section 3. What is Peter Griffin really? Here is a question that sounds ridiculous on its surface, but becomes genuinely fascinating the longer you sit with it. What is Peter Griffin? Not who he is, not what his job is or what his relationships are. What he fundamentally is, as an entity existing in this fictional universe, the answer that the show presents on its surface is obvious. Peter is a working-class man from Rhode Island. He is overweight, not particularly intelligent, easily distracted, given to impulsive behavior, and broadly good-natured despite his many failures. He loves beer, his wife, his children to varying degrees, and his friends. He is the patriarch of the Griffin household, the anchor of the series, the character around whom every storyline revolves in some way. That is the surface answer, the official one. But the deeper you look into Peter's lore, the more the edges start to blur. Because Peter Griffin has done things, survived things, and demonstrated capabilities that should not be possible for a regular human being operating under normal physical laws. And the show has gone out of its way on multiple occasions to hint that Peter might be something other than what he appears to be. Let us start with the physical. Peter Griffin has survived circumstances that would kill an ordinary human being multiple times over. He has been hit by cars, fallen from tremendous heights, been involved in industrial accidents, absorbed weapons-grade physical trauma on a near-weekly basis, and walked away from all of it with little more than a running gag about his knee. The show's violence is cartoonish, yes, and cartoon physics do not apply the same rules as reality. But even within the universe's own internal logic, Peter's ability to survive things that clearly kill other characters is notable. The most famous demonstration of this is his relationship with Ernie the Giant Chicken, a running character who appears sporadically throughout the series and always triggers an extended, cinematic, brutally destructive fight between himself and Peter. These fights cause genuine chaos. Buildings collapse, bystanders are killed. Property damage on a massive scale unfolds in every direction as Peter and Ernie crash through walls, fall off structures, and subject each other to harm that should absolutely be fatal. And yet both of them survive, reset, and are ready to go again. The origin of the feud is surprisingly mundane. Ernie gave Peter an expired coupon, as revealed in the Season 2 episode Da Boom, one expired coupon. And Peter's response to this minor slight was to assault a giant chicken and begin a decades-long cycle of catastrophic violence. This disproportionate response is part of the joke, obviously. But the fact that a human-scale fight between Peter and an oversized chicken consistently results in mass civilian casualties and structural devastation tells you something about the scale of force that Peter is apparently capable of. He is not fighting like a regular man. He is fighting like something much harder to explain. Then there is the matter of Peter's intelligence, or more precisely, the dramatically inconsistent range of his intelligence across different episodes. In the early seasons, Peter was portrayed as a man of limited but functional intelligence. He could hold down a job, make plans, execute schemes, form arguments, and demonstrate emotional awareness when the situation genuinely called for it. He was dumb, certainly, but he was operating within the range of a recognizable human mind. As the show went on, Peter's intelligence deteriorated to levels that strain plausibility. There are episodes in the later seasons where Peter fails to understand concepts so basic that a young child would grasp them. He demonstrates gaps in knowledge and reasoning so severe that you have to wonder how he manages to dress himself in the morning, let alone hold a job and operate a motor vehicle and maintain a family. And yet in other episodes, sometimes in the same season or even the same episode, Peter demonstrates surprising competence. He successfully navigates complex social situations. He achieves things that require sustained effort and skill. He shows emotional intelligence and self-awareness that his other behavior would suggest is completely beyond him. The inconsistency is not just the result of bad writing, though that is certainly part of it. It creates a character who seems to exist at multiple levels simultaneously, capable of anything the plot needs him to be capable of, and incapable of anything the plot needs him to fail at. One of the most significant and under-examined aspects of Peter's nature is his apparent immunity to consequence. The show has a reset mechanism built into it. No matter what terrible things happen in one episode, the next episode begins fresh, with everything restored and no lasting damage. This is standard for animated comedy, as we noted. But Peter, specifically, seems to exist in a bubble that extends even within individual episodes. He can do genuinely horrible things to people and face no meaningful accountability. He can destroy relationships, cause physical harm, wreck his home, endanger his community, and the world arranges itself to make sure none of it sticks. The dark theory reading of this is that Peter is not actually experiencing consequences because the universe around him is not real in the way we assume it is. It is a construct, a simulation or a dream or a coping mechanism. The world bends to keep Peter whole because the world exists for Peter, not the other way around. This connects to one of the most unsettling fan theories in the Family Guy community. The theory that Peter Griffin is not at home with his family at all, but is instead a patient in a mental institution, and that the events of the show are entirely the product of a broken, grieving mind. The version of this theory that has been developed most thoroughly goes like this. At some point before the show begins, Peter and Lois lost their children. Meg and Chris died in a drunk driving accident, possibly with Meg behind the wheel, which would explain the family's inexplicable hatred of her, a hatred that functions more like displaced guilt and grief than like actual dislike. Lois, who was pregnant with Stewie at the time, was destroyed by the loss and eventually died of her grief or despair. Peter, left alone and shattered, was committed to a psychiatric facility. Everything the audience sees is Peter's mind constructing a version of the life he lost. His family is alive in his imagination. Meg is still there, but his subconscious cannot forgive her for the accident, so she is endlessly punished. Chris is present but intellectually stunted, perhaps reflecting the oxygen deprivation mentioned in fan readings of Chris's characterization. Stewie is the baby who was never born, reimagined as a genius whose extraordinary mind is Peter's way of giving his unborn child everything he wished he could have given him. Brian is a dog who could speak, because in Peter's broken mind, the loneliness of the institution has conjured a companion who can actually hold a conversation. The evidence that fans point to includes the general impossibility of the events in the show, which function more like dream logic than real-world logic. Peter's immunity to consequence. The way certain characters seem to appear from nowhere with no explanation. The show's willingness to kill Peter and resurrect him, to destroy everything and rebuild it, to subject the family to horrors that no real family could survive intact. In a dream, all of this is possible. In a dream, you can lose your house and still have your house. You can watch your family members die and still sit down to breakfast with them the next morning. It is a theory that the show itself never confirms or denies. But it is remarkably hard to dismiss, because the more episodes you watch back to back, the more the accumulated weight of impossible events starts to feel less like comedy license and more like a mind that cannot distinguish between what is real and what it wishes were real. There is a second, somewhat less dark interpretation of Peter's nature that has also been developed at length in the fan community. The hive mind theory. This theory, proposed by a Reddit user who goes by the name Phase, Poopy, and expanded considerably by others in the community, suggests that the reason Peter's history and personality keep changing is that Peter is not a single individual at all. He is a recurring type. A template. The show is not following one man named Peter Griffin across his life. It is following many different men who share the same broad characteristics, and the universe shuffles between them so fluidly that the audience never quite catches the seams. Under this reading, the Peter of the early seasons and the Peter of the later seasons are not the same person who has changed. They are different Peters, different instances of the same archetype, pulled from a pool of parallel versions and placed into the story as needed. This is why his intelligence fluctuates. This is why his emotional range is so wildly inconsistent. This is why his backstory keeps shifting. Different Peters have different histories. It is a theory that will feel more satisfying after we spend time in the multiverse section, because the show itself has established that parallel universes exist and that Stewie can navigate between them. If the multiverse is real within this universe, then the hive mind theory is not science fiction. It is a logical extension of the show's own established lore. But there is another, simpler, and yet somehow more unsettling aspect of Peter's nature that deserves examination before we move on. The question of what exactly Peter Griffin has done, not the comedic terrible things, not the falling down and the fighting, the chicken and the farting, the things the show presents as funny but which, if you take them at face value and remove the laugh track from your head, are genuinely disturbing. Peter has endangered his entire neighborhood on numerous occasions. He has caused deaths through negligence and recklessness. He has treated his daughter with a sustained cruelty that the show occasionally almost acknowledges but never truly reckons with. He has been a bad father, a dangerous neighbor, a man whose impulses consistently produce harm for the people around him, and the world has shielded him from every consequence. The question is not whether this makes Peter a bad character in the writing sense. The question is what it tells us about the universe he lives in. Because a universe that consistently protects a man like Peter from the results of his own behavior is not a neutral universe. It is a universe that has chosen him, has decided, for reasons we cannot quite see, that Peter Griffin is protected, that what he does and what he survives and what the world allows him to get away with is not random. It is a feature. And if it is a feature, we need to ask who built it, who decided that Peter Griffin was worth protecting, what the rules of this universe actually are beneath the surface comedy. Those are questions that will run through the rest of this exploration, surfacing in different forms as we move through the other mysteries. For now, let us turn to the character who lives under Peter's roof and has never quite been explained to anyone's full satisfaction. The baby in the yellow shirt who arrived in this world with weapons already built and a plan already forming. Section 4. Stewie Griffin, the evil genius problem. Stewie Griffin is 1 year old? That sentence is the foundation of one of the most spectacularly unexplained mysteries in all of animated television. Because a 1-year-old baby should not be capable of constructing functional laser weapons. He should not be able to design and build a working time machine. He should not be able to synthesize chemical compounds, plot tactical operations, deliver extended monologues in a polished British accent, or maintain the kind of sustained strategic thinking required to pursue a serious campaign of world domination. He should not be able to do any of these things. And yet, in the first 3 seasons of Family Guy, Stewie Griffin does all of them on a fairly regular basis. The question of where Stewie came from, not just biologically, but in terms of who or what he actually is, has occupied fan theorists for the entire run of the show. There is no official explanation. Seth MacFarlane and the writing team have never offered a canon reason for why this particular baby was born with the mind of a supervillain. The show simply presents it as the premise and trusts the audience not to ask why. But asking why turns out to be one of the most interesting things you can do with this universe. The most straightforward fan theory about Stewie's origin holds that he is not simply an unusually intelligent baby. He is something more specific than that. He is the reincarnation of a historical figure, possibly a former dictator or military leader, whose consciousness has been transferred into an infant body either through magic, supernatural mechanics, or some kind of technology that the show's universe contains but has not fully explained. The evidence for this theory is scattered but compelling. Stewie's British accent has no natural explanation. Peter and Lois are American. Their other children have American accents. The Griffin household has no significant British connection. For Stewie to have developed a refined, upper-class English accent as a 1-year-old baby requires an explanation that biological development simply cannot provide. He did not learn to speak from his parents. He speaks the way he does because he arrived already speaking that way. He came with a voice that was formed somewhere else. His personality deepens this impression. Stewie does not think like a baby who has developed extraordinary intelligence. He thinks like an adult, an old adult, who understands institutional power, who has experience commanding other people, who knows what it feels like to have authority and have it taken away. His obsession with killing Lois is not just a dark joke. It reads, in the early seasons, like the behavior of someone who genuinely cannot tolerate being powerless and dependent, who experiences his own infancy as a humiliation and a trap, rather than a natural stage of development. His plans for world domination are not the fantasies of a clever child who has seen too much television. They are detailed, operational, technically sophisticated. Stewie in Season 1 is not imagining power. He is planning for it with the mindset of someone who has held it before and wants it back. The former dictator theory, sometimes called the reincarnation theory, resolves a lot of this. A man who was once a leader, who commanded armies and held populations in terror, who died and found himself inexplicably trapped in a baby's body in a Rhode Island suburb, would feel exactly the impotent, world-destroying rage that early Stewie projects. He would have a British accent because he was British in his previous life. He would have the engineering knowledge to build weapons because he remembered how weapons worked. He would want to kill Lois because Lois, as his mother, represents the humiliating dependency that his consciousness is forced to endure. Some fans have suggested the specific identity of Oliver Cromwell, the 17th century English military and political leader whose rigid ideology, iron will, and complete intolerance for opposition maps surprisingly well onto early Stewie's personality. Cromwell died in 1658. The idea that his consciousness rattled around for centuries before landing in the Griffin household in the late 1990s is obviously not something the show would ever confirm. But as a reading, it gives Stewie's character a layer of historical resonance that makes it considerably more interesting. The show itself briefly dances around this kind of thinking in scattered moments. In one episode, Stewie is told via a palm reading that He was Jack the Ripper in a previous life, though this comes from Quagmire's description, not Stewie's, so it should be taken with appropriate skepticism. Still, it plants the idea Stewie has a past that predates his current body. Then there is the alternate theory, which takes a more psychological approach. This theory, popular in a different corner of the fandom, proposes that Stewie is not actually speaking out loud at all. That the articulate, British accented, world domination plotting version of Stewie that the audience hears is entirely the product of Stewie's own internal experience as an infant, and that what we are watching is the subjective consciousness of a baby who experiences the world with extraordinary intensity, but communicates it in nothing but gurgles and cries. Under this theory, the reason most characters cannot hear Stewie is not because they choose to ignore him or cannot understand him. It is because he is not actually speaking. Brian can hear him because in Stewie's mind, Brian is a trusted companion, so his imagination grants Brian the ability to communicate in return. The cutaway gags and the elaborate schemes exist in Stewie's mental experience of reality, not in the show's objective reality. This theory creates some interesting supporting evidence when you look at specific moments in the show. There are times when Stewie's plans, however elaborate they are when presented from his perspective, achieve nothing in the external world. Characters walk through his carefully constructed traps without noticing them. His weapons discharge and the people they target seem unaffected. The giant systems he builds in his room are apparently invisible to everyone who is not Brian. If the show's universe is taking the position that Stewie's genius exists only in his own perception, then the gradual softening of his character over the seasons makes a different kind of sense. Not as a story development decision, but as the natural psychological arc of a baby growing up. The intensity of infancy fading. The extraordinary inner world of early childhood giving way to the more social, relationship-oriented consciousness of a toddler who wants a friend more than he wants an army. But here is the complication with both of these theories. There are moments in the show where Stewie's actions have unambiguous physical consequences in the external world. He shoots Brian in the leg in the episode Back to the Pilot. Brian bleeds. He responds. He limps afterward. Stewie's gun fired a real bullet into a real character. This is not internal experience. This is objective action with objective consequence. Similarly, the time machine is used in episodes that involve other characters traveling through it, experiencing its effects, and arriving in the past or future where the consequences of their journey affect the main narrative. If the time machine were purely imaginary, it could not do any of this. So we are left with a middle ground that is actually the most interesting space to occupy. Stewie exists in some capacity between pure imagination and full physical reality. His weapons work sometimes. His machines function on certain occasions. His voice is heard by some characters in some situations. The rules governing exactly when and how his genius manifests in the external world are never stated, never consistent, and never explained. That inconsistency is itself a clue. It suggests that the question of how real Stewie's extraordinary capabilities are is not something the universe has settled. The answer shifts depending on what the story needs. And that kind of narrative flexibility is exactly what you would expect from a universe that is not operating on fixed physical laws, but on something more like dream logic, or the logic of a story being told by an unreliable narrator. Speaking of which, there is a theory that the entire show is being told from Stewie's perspective, that the audience is not watching an objective record of events, but a story as a baby understands it, with all the exaggeration and misinterpretation and wish fulfillment that brings. Peter's impossibly cartoonish stupidity and invincibility. Lois's strange combination of patience and quiet menace. The way certain rules of physics apply sometimes and not others. All of it filtered through the perceptions of a 1-year-old who has no context for what is actually happening around him and fills the gaps with imagination. This theory explains the show's reality better than almost any other. It is a universe seen through the eyes of a baby genius. And everything that doesn't make sense about it is simply the baby's misunderstanding. His fear, his love, his rage, his boredom, all projected outward onto a world that he is trying very hard to comprehend and command. We will never know for certain which of these readings is closest to the truth, because the show was never designed to have a definitive answer. It was designed to be funny, not to be internally consistent. But the fact that these questions exist and that they produce such rich, layered thinking about a cartoon baby's nature is itself a kind of answer. Stewie Griffin is one of those rare fictional creations who contains more depth than was probably intended, who rewards the kind of prolonged staring that most entertainment is not built to withstand. And the mystery of what he is, which season 1 presented as the most urgent and central mystery of the show, remains open 25 years later. We know he was a genius. We know he wanted the world. We know he had a time machine and weapons and plans of magnificent complexity, but we do not know why. We do not know what he is, and the show never told us. Section 5. Brian Griffin, the dog who should not exist. Of all the mysteries in the Family Guy universe, the one surrounding Brian Griffin is in some ways the most philosophically rich, because it is the one that the show itself explicitly teases but refuses to resolve. Brian Edward Griffin is described as a white Labrador retriever who is 7 years old in dog years, which translates to approximately 49 human years, making him technically older than any of the adult human characters in the show by a significant margin. He stands upright, drives cars, drinks martinis, attended Brown University, has held various jobs, maintains romantic relationships with human women, and participates in the full social and intellectual life of the adult community around him. His voice, manner, and general worldview are those of a sophisticated, educated adult human being. The show does not explain why Brian is like this. It does not explain why this one specific dog developed human-level intelligence and communication abilities. It does not explain why the Griffin family treats his human-like behavior as entirely normal while maintaining the social fiction that he is their pet. Let us start with the question of Brian's origins, because even here the show cannot keep its story straight. The first and most commonly referenced explanation for how Brian came to live with the Griffins is the one given in the episode Brian, Portrait of a Dog, which aired in season 1. In that episode, a flashback shows Peter finding Brian as a stray on the side of the road, a fully grown dog washing car windshields for change, who Peter felt sorry for and invited into his home. This is the foundational Brian origin story. Adult Brian, already intelligent and articulate, discovered as a homeless stray and adopted by Peter Griffin. But then in the season 7 episode, The Man with Two Brians, Brian produces a collection of home videos that show him as a puppy. In these videos, he is already inside the Griffin home, already a member of the family. This directly contradicts the adoption story, because if Brian was a stray that Peter found and took in as an adult, there would be no home videos of him as a puppy in the Griffin household. The show waves this away rather casually by suggesting that the puppy videos might have been filmed by a previous owner. But this creates a new problem. If Brian had a previous owner, who was it? What happened to them? Why does Brian never reference this part of his life? The show returns to this question in season 19 with the episode Who's Brian Now?, in which a microchip scanner reveals that Brian had a previous family before the Griffins. He goes to meet them and finds a wealthy, sophisticated household that seems more aligned with his intellectual and social aspirations. The episode uses this discovery to explore Brian's complicated relationship with the Griffins, but it does not explain when exactly Brian was with the Hendersons or how he ended up as a stray between that family and Peter finding him. The most intriguing theory about Brian's true nature, the one that has generated the most discussion in the fan community, comes from the intersection of Family Guy and American Dad. The show's own lore has established, through various crossover references and shared universe moments, that Family Guy and American Dad exist in the same world. They are not parallel universes. They are the same fictional reality. And in American Dad, there is a character named Klaus, who is a German Olympic athlete whose brain was surgically placed into the body of a goldfish by the CIA. Klaus, the fish, is intelligent because he is not really a fish. He is a human consciousness trapped in a non-human body. The theory that has been developed in the fan community asks a fairly obvious question in light of this. If the CIA is willing to transplant human brains into animal bodies in this universe, and if we know this has happened at least once to create an intelligent talking animal, then why couldn't the same thing explain Brian? Under this theory, Brian Griffin is not a dog who developed human intelligence through some unexplained natural process. He is a human being, almost certainly a CIA operative given the American Dad connection, whose brain was surgically placed into a dog's body. This would explain everything. His ability to speak, his education, his knowledge of literature, film, politics, and culture that he could not have acquired as a dog, his complete comfort navigating human social situations, his attraction to human women, which would not be bizarre if he were himself, in his deepest self, a human man. The CIA angle deepens when you consider that the show's universe is one in which the CIA operates aggressively and without much apparent oversight. The town of Spooner Street sits inside a larger American context in which extraordinary things happen to ordinary people, and the government is often quietly involved in ways that the narrative does not fully illuminate. There is a specific moment in the show that fans who hold this theory find particularly suggestive. In an episode involving Russian spy activity, Brian and Stewie discover that the Russians have placed sleeper agents throughout the community. At the end of the episode, Stewie utters the activation phrase and Meg immediately responds, revealing herself to be a sleeper agent. She gets on the phone, speaks Russian, and is told to be quiet by the operative on the other end. But what is less discussed is that this scene exists in a universe where it is apparently normal for the Russian intelligence service to have operatives embedded in a random Rhode Island suburb. If Russia is doing this, why not the CIA? If the CIA is also conducting operations in this community, and if they are known to transplant human consciousness into animal bodies, then Brian living with the Griffins could be an assignment. He could have been placed there deliberately. Who Brian's human identity was, if this theory is correct, is unknown. The show has never pointed in a specific direction, but fans have speculated widely, with some suggesting Brian might be a former intelligence asset, or a scientist who developed the consciousness transfer technology, or simply an ordinary person who was subjected to experimental procedures. The other deeply strange aspect of Brian's existence is his relationship with time and aging. Brian is stated to be 7 years old. In dog biology, 7 years is roughly equivalent to late middle age, somewhere in the 49 to 55-year range by most estimates. This would make Brian one of the oldest characters in the show's core cast. Yet his emotional arc, his romantic history, his professional struggles, and his general sense of his own life all read like those of a person in their late 20s or early 30s. This disconnect might simply be the result of the writers not thinking too hard about the dog years math, but it creates an interesting reading if you take it seriously. Brian lives in a compressed biological timeline that his human-level consciousness has not adjusted to. He experiences his life as though he has decades ahead of him, while his body is actually moving through its lifespan at a much faster pace. His urgency around his failed writing career, his frustrated romantic ambitions, his sense that he hasn't yet become who he is supposed to be, all of it lands differently if you remember that, in biological terms, his clock is running at 7 times the speed of a human's. The death of Brian in Season 12 is the show's most explicit engagement with this reality. When Brian is hit by a car and dies in the episode Life of Brian, the show treats it as a genuine loss. The family grieves. Stewie is devastated. A replacement dog named Vinny is brought in, and for 2 episodes the universe attempts to continue without him. Then Stewie uses a stolen time travel device to go back and prevent Brian's death, and everything resets. The fan response to this sequence was enormous. Many people were genuinely upset by Brian's death, having spent years watching the character. Others were furious at the resurrection, seeing it as a cheap rating stunt that invalidated the emotional impact of the death. But what both responses missed was a more interesting question. Why did the universe allow Brian to die in the first place? Every other core character is effectively invincible within the show's logic. Peter survives things that should clearly kill him. Stewie has been in situations that should end his life and emerged fine. Brian, for all his human-level capabilities, was killed by a car in a mundane accident that lasted seconds. There was no dramatic buildup. There was no villain responsible. He was simply in the street and a car hit him. And then the universe, specifically through Stewie's intervention, decided that this outcome was unacceptable and reversed it. This raises a question about what role Brian plays in the universe's functioning, because the universe does not undo Peter's messes. It does not prevent Meg's suffering. It does not intervene in the normal consequences of normal events, but it did not allow Brian to stay dead. Something protected him. Something made sure he came back. If Brian is a CIA operative embedded in the Griffin household, perhaps that protection makes more sense. His handlers would not allow him to stay dead. They would activate whatever mechanism exists to restore him to his position. Stewie's time travel device might not have been his own solution to the problem. It might have been a resource that existed for exactly this purpose, available to him because the people managing this situation wanted Brian back in the house. It is a reading that elevates Brian from a beloved cartoon character to something much stranger and more operationally significant. A placed asset in a household that may be under surveillance for reasons we have not yet fully explored. And that brings us to the household itself, the neighborhood, the town, because the family and their friends do not exist in a vacuum. They exist in a specific place, a specific community, and that community has its own deep mysteries that deserve extended examination. Section 6. The Town's Secrets Underneath Spooner Street. The show is set in the town of Quahog, Rhode Island. Wait, let me be clear about what I mean, because the show uses that word and I will need to describe the setting without leaning on it as a verbal shortcut. The setting is a fictional small city in Rhode Island. Spooner Street, where the Griffin family lives, is the center of gravity for most of the show's storylines. The Griffins' immediate neighbors are Joe Swanson, the police officer, and his wife Bonnie, and Glenn Quagmire, the airline pilot. Cleveland Brown and his family live nearby until Cleveland departs for his own spin-off show. On the surface, this is an ordinary American neighborhood, houses in a row, a local bar called the Drunken Clam where Peter and his friends spend much of their free time, a high school named after James Woods and later renamed after Adam West, a brewery that produces Pawtucket Patriot Ale, where Peter works for much of the series, a local hospital, a town hall presided over by the endlessly eccentric Mayor Adam West. But underneath this picture of ordinary suburban life, the town is a deeply strange place that has accumulated an enormous number of unanswered questions about its own nature. Start with the governance. Mayor Adam West, voiced by the actual late actor Adam West, served as the town's mayor from his introduction in Season 2 until his death in Season 17, which corresponded to the real-world death of Adam West in 2017. During his tenure, Mayor West made decisions of extraordinary irrationality. He spent $100,000 in tax money to investigate who had been staring at him. He attempted to build a solid gold statue of a serial mascot. He banned the color green, then unbanned it. He legalized and then immediately rebanned marijuana within the span of a few days. He was caught building a poorly designed maze under City Hall. He ate a lot of magnets. On paper, this is all played as comedy about an eccentric mayor who abuses his office for personal whims. But the pattern of behavior, when you look at it as a whole, suggests something more specific than pure eccentricity. Mayor West's decisions consistently destabilized the community. His choice to legalize marijuana led to a period where the town functioned more calmly and peacefully than usual, which is exactly why he reversed the decision. His spending of public funds on bizarre personal projects consistently depletes resources that the community needs for actual services. His behavior at public events reliably derails whatever the community is trying to accomplish. A theory that has circulated in the fan community, usually with a tongue-in-cheek quality but with more depth than it initially appears to have, is that Mayor West is not actually eccentric. He is corrupt in a very specific way. He is either deliberately destabilizing the community to keep it dependent and controllable, or he is being used by the larger power structures in the show's universe to serve that function. The larger power structure in question is the Pewter-Schmidt family. Carter Pewter-Schmidt, Lois's father, owns Pewter-Schmidt Industries and U.S. Steel and has his fingers in countless local and national businesses. He is the kind of billionaire who, in the real world, would absolutely exercise influence over local politics in the communities where his businesses operate. The show acknowledges this level of power explicitly in multiple episodes. Carter can and does intervene in local affairs when it serves his interests. The question is whether Carter is actively managing Quahog's governance. Whether the eccentric mayor who spends public funds on gold cereal statues and bans the color green is not a random historical accident but a managed outcome. A mayor who is too preoccupied with his own bizarre obsessions to examine what Pewter-Schmidt Industries is doing with the local environment, economy, and population. This reading becomes significantly more sinister when you add the detail about the cancer cure. In the Season 11 episode, The Old Man and the Big C, Brian and Stewie discover that Carter's pharmaceutical company is sitting on a functioning cure for cancer. They know it works. They have tested it. And they have chosen not to release it to the public because the ongoing treatment of cancer is more financially valuable to Pewter Schmidt Industries than a single cure would be. Carter is actively allowing people to die of cancer in order to maintain his profit margins. This is presented as a dark joke in the show. Carter is bad. Carter does bad things. Everyone knows this. And then the plot moves on. But the implications of this are not something the show ever seriously sits with. Carter Pewter Schmidt is not just a man who is mean to his son-in-law. He is a man whose deliberate decision-making has killed an unknown but presumably enormous number of people. The show also reveals elsewhere that Carter has given an entire town cancer through improper disposal of chemical waste. So he is not just withholding the cure for a disease. He is actively causing the disease and then withholding the cure. This is, in the plainest terms, mass murder. It is a crime of a scale that most fictional villains never approach, and the show treats it as a character quirk and then returns to Peter falling down. The geographical and community-level mysteries of the town extend beyond Carter's influence. The Drunken Clam Bar, where Peter and his friends spend most of their social lives, is a location that has been destroyed, renovated, sold, and restored multiple times across the show's run, and it always comes back in essentially the same form. This is partly the reset mechanism at work. But the bar's owner, a character named Horace who operates it for much of the series, is himself a subtle mystery. Horace has almost no personal backstory. He appears, he serves drinks, he occasionally makes a brief comment, and then he exits frame. For a location that is so central to the show's social life, the man running it is remarkably undefined. There are fan theories suggesting Horace is a deliberate blank, a character who exists to be seen and not examined, possibly because closer examination would raise questions about the Drunken Clam's role in the community that the show does not want to answer. Then there is Spooner Street itself as a physical location and what it implies about the community's economics and social structure. Peter works at a brewery making what appears to be a modest salary. Lois teaches piano lessons at home. They have 3 children, a dog, and a house in what appears to be a comfortable middle-class neighborhood. Yet the Griffins consistently engage in activities, own objects, and take vacations that their described income should not be able to support. Peter has taken the family to multiple international destinations. He has purchased vehicles, equipment, and experiences that would be out of reach for a brewery worker's household budget. This economic inconsistency is present in almost every long-running animated family sitcom, so in isolation it is not remarkable. But in combination with the Griffin family's proximity to the Pewter Schmidt money, it raises a question. How much is Carter Pewter Schmidt subsidizing his daughter's family? He claims to hate Peter. He refuses to give them money on multiple occasions, and yet the Griffin family's lifestyle consistently exceeds what their income would explain. One theory suggests that Carter is quietly funding the Griffin household in ways he would never acknowledge, possibly through Lois, possibly through trusts or funds that operate without Peter's knowledge. He hates Peter, but he loves Lois, at least in his complicated way, and he would not want to see her suffer materially even if he could not resist making her suffer emotionally by continually disapproving of her choices. The neighborhood as a physical space also has the peculiar quality of all spaces in this universe. It resets. Houses burn down and are rebuilt. Structures that should mark the landscape permanently somehow do not. The neighborhood absorbs extraordinary events, from alien visitations to government actions to catastrophic fights between a man and a giant chicken, and returns to exactly the state it was in before. This is the most persistent and pervasive mystery of the show's universe. Not a mystery of plot or character, but a mystery of ontology. The question of why this particular neighborhood, these particular streets, these particular people, seem to exist in a state of permanent stasis, where nothing that happens ever permanently changes anything. Some answers we have already touched on. The mental institution theory holds that the stasis is a product of Peter's delusional mind, which cannot generate genuine change because it is protecting itself from the grief of real loss. The hive mind theory holds that the stasis exists because the universe is cycling through parallel versions rather than following a single timeline. The simulation theory holds that the universe has been designed with a reset function built into it, serving whoever or whatever is running the simulation. But there is one more answer worth considering, and it is the one that the show's own mythology most directly supports. The answer that involves the rules of death in this universe, and what it means that Death himself is a character in this story who has been seen, spoken to, injured, and even killed. Section 7. The Multiverse, which Family Guy are we actually watching? Season 8 of Family Guy opens with what is, in retrospect, one of the most significant episodes in the show's entire run. Not because of its comedy, though it has some genuinely inspired moments, but because of what it reveals about the fundamental structure of the universe these characters inhabit. Road to the Multiverse introduces the concept that has gone on to become one of the most important tools in the fan theory community's understanding of this show. Stewie has built a device that allows him to travel between parallel universes, infinite universes, coexisting on parallel dimensional planes, each one a different version of the reality the audience has been watching. In some of these universes, the changes are minor. In others, the differences are radical enough to render the world completely unrecognizable. This is not just a premise for a fun episode. This is a canonical fact about the structure of this fictional universe. Parallel realities exist, they are accessible. And the version of the Griffin family that the audience watches every week is not the only version. It is one version among an infinite number of them. This revelation lands differently depending on which part of the fan community you are asking. For the casual viewer, it is a fun premise for an episode with some memorable alternate world jokes. For the theoretically inclined viewer, it retroactively recontextualizes the entire show. Because if parallel universes are real in this universe, then every contradiction in the show's timeline and lore has a ready explanation. The Peter who grew up in the 1970s and the Peter who grew up in the 1980s are not the same Peter experiencing a continuity error. They are different Peters from different universes, and the show has been following multiple universes simultaneously, switching between them as needed without announcement. The timeline problems with Meg's father, with Brian's adoption story, with Peter's biological origins, and the question of whether Nate Griffin is actually his ancestor. All of it dissolves once you accept that the show is not following a single timeline, but is instead moving through a multiverse, sometimes visiting the same universe twice, sometimes switching to a different one for an episode or a season without ever explicitly marking the transition. This theory was developed extensively by several fan communities and is most associated with a post on Reddit that argued the following. The post-cancellation version of Family Guy, the show that returned in 2005 after 3 years off the air, is actually set in a different universe from the one that was canceled in 2002. The characters look the same. The names are the same. But their personalities, their relationship dynamics, and their histories all shifted in ways that accumulated over time until the people on screen bore only a surface resemblance to the people who had been on screen before the cancellation. Under this reading, Brian and Stewie's adventures in Back to the Pilot, where they travel back in time to the first episode of the show, are not actually time travel within a single timeline. They are inter-universal travel, visiting the original universe from the post-revival universe. The Stewie and Brian who traveled back to the pilot are not the same versions as the Stewie and Brian in the pilot. They come from a different version of the same world. This reading is supported by a detail in the Back to the Pilot episode that is easy to miss. When Stewie and Brian observe the original pilot, the characters they see behave in recognizable ways, but there are subtle differences in tone and manner that the episode frames as the result of older versus newer animation styles. But what if those differences are not just visual? What if they are indicating that these are genuinely different versions of these characters? The multiverse theory is also the most satisfying answer to the question of why the show's moral universe shifted so dramatically between the early seasons and the later ones. In the early seasons, the Griffin family was a dysfunctional but fundamentally loving unit. They hurt each other, but they cared about each other underneath the chaos. In the later seasons, the relationships became colder, more contemptuous, more openly cruel. The simplest explanation is that the writing changed. But the multiverse explanation is more interesting. The family we are watching in the later seasons is a different family. They have the same names and faces and address, but they live in a different universe where the emotional temperature runs colder, where the rules of consequence work differently, where Peter is crueler and Brian is more insufferable, and Meg is treated as something less than a full human being. This is not a comforting explanation. The idea that you could be watching a version of the Griffin family that exists in a universe where things are simply worse, where the warmth has been taken out of the world, where the people you grew to care about in the early seasons have been replaced by harder, colder versions of themselves, is not a cheerful thought, but it is a coherent one. And coherence is something that Family Guy's lore rarely offers, so when a theory can make the chaos make sense, it deserves serious consideration. There are additional mysteries introduced by the multiverse that the show has never resolved. The device Stewie uses to navigate between universes in Road to the Multiverse is broken at the end of that episode when Brian accidentally drops it. A dog Stewie from the dog-ruled universe helps them get home, but the main device is destroyed. How, then, does Stewie continue to do interdimensional work in subsequent episodes? He clearly has replacement technology, but the show never explains how he built or acquired it. If he can build such a device once, that is remarkable. If he can rebuild it indefinitely after it gets destroyed, the technology is effectively unlimited, which changes what we understand about Stewie's capabilities and what he could theoretically do if he wanted to. The question of other versions of the Griffin family also lingers. In the dog-ruled universe, there is a version of the family that is entirely canine, with a human Brian as their pet. What happens to that universe? What happens to the human Stewie who was imprisoned in the dog pound and nearly euthanized? These characters exist. They are real within the fiction, and then the episode ends and they are never mentioned again. The multiverse as a concept implies that every story the show has ever told, every character death, every major loss, every moment of genuine emotional consequence, exists somewhere in the infinite stack of parallel realities as a permanent record. The episodes where Brian dies stay true in the universe where they happened, even if Stewie's time travel closed off that branch in the main timeline. The episodes where characters were reduced to nothing, where relationships were destroyed, where harm was done that should be irreversible, all of it persists somewhere in the multiverse, in versions of this world where nobody stepped in to undo it. That is a quietly haunting thought. The Family Guy multiverse is not just a comedy premise. It is an infinite archive of everything that was almost allowed to stay true. Section 8. Death, Resurrection, and the Rules of Existence. Death is a recurring character in the Family Guy universe. Not death as a concept, not the statistical inevitability of mortality, but death as a person. A man in a cloak. A grim reaper who has a mother he calls on the phone and a difficulty interacting with women, and a tendency to get into awkward situations that are fully incompatible with the gravity and finality that death is supposed to represent. This personification of death has appeared multiple times in the show's history, starting with Season 2's Death is a Bitch, in which Peter fakes his own death to avoid a hospital bill, inadvertently attracting the attention of the actual death, who is then injured chasing Peter and is unable to collect souls for a while. The episode plays the premise entirely for laughs, but underneath the comedy is a genuinely interesting piece of lore. If death is a character in this universe, if he can be injured, if he has a bad ankle that can be sprained and takes time to heal, if he has feelings about his social failures and a mother who worries about him, then death in this universe is not an absolute force. He is not the inescapable terminus of biological existence. He is a person doing a job, and jobs can be delayed. Jobs can be disrupted. The person doing the job can be incapacitated. This is why people in the Family Guy universe survive things they should not survive. This is why Peter has walked away from circumstances that should have ended him. Death is not an automatic process in this world. Death requires someone to show up and take you. And if that someone is delayed or distracted or dealing with a sprained ankle or simply has too many cases to handle at once, you might just not die. Not yet. Maybe not for a while. Season 11 introduces another layer to this when Death himself is killed in a traffic accident caused by Carter Pewterschmidt. A larger, more powerful entity called Super Death arrives to oversee Death's transition, and Death is told he is being reincarnated in China as a girl. So, Death in this universe is not permanent either. Death can be reincarnated. Death can be reborn. Which suggests that the rule of impermanence applies not just to the characters we follow, but to the entire system of mortality itself. What this means for the show's universe is that death is not a wall. It is a revolving door. Characters come back from it. Brian came back. Characters die in cutaways and are alive in the next scene. Death comes and goes and is replaced, and the whole system operates with a looseness that suggests the universe does not take mortality particularly seriously. This connects back to the reset mechanism we keep encountering. The universe resets because it can. Because in a world where death himself is just a person with a job, there is no reason why anything needs to stay dead. The only permanent losses in this universe are the ones that feel like they should be undone but are not. And even those, in the infinite multiverse of parallel realities, are only locally permanent. Somewhere in a parallel universe, every loss is recovered. The rules of existence in the Family Guy universe were also complicated significantly by the show's engagement with its own past through time travel. The episode Back to the Pilot in Season 10 sends Brian and Stewie back to the events of the first episode, and Brian, racked with guilt about knowing but not warning anyone about the September 11 attacks, warns his past self. This triggers a cascade of consequences that result in a changed timeline, where Brian and Stewie find themselves in an alternate world and have to undo the damage. This episode is remarkable for several reasons. First, it establishes that causality in this universe is alterable but not infinitely so. You can change the past, but the changes ripple outward in ways that cannot always be predicted or controlled. Second, it suggests that the show's own past is somehow accessible from its present, not just as a memory, but as a physical location that can be visited. The pilot episode is a place you can go. It exists as a real space within the show's reality. This creates a fascinating philosophical puzzle. If the past is accessible, and if changes to the past can produce different timelines, and if different timelines produce different versions of the characters, then what is the relationship between the show as it currently exists and all the versions of itself that would have existed if different choices had been made? Brian's warning about September 11 inches, that episode, is one of the most quietly significant moments in the show's entire history, because it takes the show's comedy universe and plants it directly in the most traumatic historical event of the era it was made in. Seth MacFarlane has spoken publicly about his own complicated feelings around September 11, having missed a flight that morning because of a hangover that prevented him from getting to the airport on time, a flight that was one of the ones that struck the towers. His personal near miss with the event is one of the most extraordinary coincidences in entertainment history, and fan theorists have noted that the show's recurring engagement with September 11 as a theme, most explicitly in this episode and in the film Stewie Griffin: The Untold Story, reflects MacFarlane processing a survivor's complex through the medium he controls. The rules of resurrection extend beyond death as a character and beyond the reset mechanism. They extend to the question of what the show counts as a genuine death versus a temporary removal from the story. Peter has been killed or appeared to die in numerous episodes and returned to full function. Stewie has died in episodes with no explanation of how he came back. Brian's death and resurrection in seasons 12 and 13 are the most narratively deliberate engagement with what death means in this universe, but they are not the only one. The show eventually arrived at a kind of implicit understanding with its audience. Nobody who matters will stay dead. The central characters are effectively unkillable, not because the universe protects them in an obvious way, but because the narrative needs them, and the narrative gets what the narrative needs. This is another version of the simulation theory. In a universe that is functionally a story, the story's needs take precedence over the internal logic of mortality. What this means is that the Griffin family and their neighbors are operating in a space that is genuinely unlike any other in animated television. They exist in a universe where death is conditional, where consequences are optional, where the rules of physical survival do not apply with any consistency. They cannot be killed by the narrative, and they cannot age, and they cannot leave, and the world will keep rebuilding itself around them, no matter what happens. That is, depending on your perspective, either a comfort or the most unsettling prison imaginable. Section 9. Meg Griffin. The conspiracy theories that change everything. There is something that the Family Guy universe has never explained about Meg Griffin, and it is not the abuse. The abuse has been analyzed endlessly by fans and critics and the show itself. No, what has never been fully explained is what Meg actually is in the context of this universe's deeper mechanics. Because here is what the show has quietly established about Meg over the years, buried under the cruelty jokes and the running gag of her being universally disliked. Meg is a Russian sleeper agent. Meg may not be Peter's biological daughter. Meg cannot taste salt. Meg apparently has access to reserves of physical strength and toughness that she rarely deploys. And Meg, in at least one possible future timeline, grows up to become a figure of considerable power and competence, while the rest of the family remains more or less the same. Let us take these one at a time. The Russian sleeper agent reveal happens in the episode where Brian and Stewie discover a Russian intelligence operation in the community. At the episode's conclusion, Stewie utters the activation phrase for Russian sleeper agents that have been placed throughout the town. Meg is sitting in the living room. The moment she hears the phrase, she stiffens. She changes completely. Her posture, her expression, her entire demeanor transforms from the slouching, unhappy teenager the audience knows into something considerably more alert and purposeful. She goes to the phone, dials, and speaks rapid, fluent Russian. The episode plays this for the joke that even as a dangerous spy, Meg gets no respect. The operative on the other end of the phone tells her to shut up. The show moves on. But consider what this moment establishes. Meg Griffin has been programmed with a trigger phrase that activates a secondary identity. She has been trained, or conditioned, or modified in some way that gave her the ability to operate as a covert intelligence asset. She speaks Russian fluently, which suggests either that she has been trained and has not conscious memory of the training, or that her secondary identity has capabilities and knowledge that her primary identity does not. This is not a comedic premise that the show stumbled into and then dropped. It is a piece of lore that was deliberately placed and then deliberately dropped, in the way the show drops many pieces of lore that complicate its characters beyond what the comedic premise needs. But the information is there. It was said. It happened. Meg Griffin has a hidden second identity with operational capabilities that her family and friends are completely unaware of. Combine this with the revelation from Screwed the Pooch that Peter is not Meg's biological father. The man who actually fathered Meg is named Stan Thompson. Meg tracks him down eventually, and the encounter is brief and painful, and he shows no real interest in her. But Stan Thompson's full background is never established. We know his name and that he was apparently a casual partner of Lois's at some point during the early days of her marriage to Peter. We do not know his job, his history, his capabilities, or what circumstances produced Meg. The theory that brings these elements together is a significant one in the fan community. It proposes that Stan Thompson is not what he appears to be, that he is, or was, connected to intelligence services, and that Meg was not an accidental pregnancy but a deliberately produced child who was placed in the Griffin household for a specific purpose. She was seated there. Her activation as a sleeper agent is not random programming that happened to fall on the Griffin household. It is the intended use of an asset that was designed from birth to be placed in a specific location and activated when needed. Under this theory, Meg's entire experience of being treated as the family outcast has a different texture. She is not just a sad teenager who was unlucky enough to be the least interesting member of a wild family. She is an intelligence asset operating under deep cover, so deep that she herself has no conscious awareness of what she is. Her normality, her desperate desire to be liked, her clinging to the family even when they treat her badly, is not weakness. It is the behavior of a cover identity designed to blend into its environment as thoroughly as possible. The abuse she suffers does not conflict with this theory. It actually deepens it. A teenager who is universally pitied and dismissed is the perfect cover for someone who should not attract attention. Nobody looks closely at the person everyone is trying to ignore. There is a second, darker Meg theory that has circulated in the community, one that proposes she is not just a cover identity, but an actual supernatural entity. This theory draws on the episode where Meg finally confronts her family and delivers her devastating account of how they have treated her, only for the family to fall apart without her as the target, and for the episode to conclude with Meg voluntarily returning to the role of family punching bag. The theory reads this episode not as a story about abuse and codependency, though it clearly is that, but as a story about a universe that requires Meg's suffering to function. The family cannot hold together without her absorbing their negative energy. When she removes herself from that role, the family disintegrates. When she returns, order is restored. This matches the behavior of a specific kind of supernatural figure found in various folklore traditions. A figure whose suffering maintains the stability of the world around them. A person whose unhappiness is the price paid for others' happiness. The details map uncomfortably well. Meg absorbs what the family cannot contain. In her absence, the family's toxicity turns inward and destroys them. Her presence is not incidental to the family's functioning. It is essential. If this reading is correct, the cruelty directed at Meg is not random or lazy writing. It is the universe managing her role, keeping her in the position she needs to occupy for the household to remain stable. The universe, which appears to operate on dream logic and selective consequence, has identified Meg as its necessary sacrificial element and has organized everything around her to ensure she stays in that position. This makes the Seahorse Seashell Party episode, where Meg chooses to return to being the family's punching bag, perhaps the most genuinely tragic moment in the show's history. Not because Meg makes a sad choice, but because the reading suggests she didn't really have a choice. The universe would not allow a different outcome. The story needed her back in her place, and the story always gets what the story needs. There is one more Meg mystery that rarely gets discussed, which is her possible future. In various flash-forward episodes, the show has offered glimpses of what the characters become as adults. The future versions of the family are not consistent across these episodes, another product of the multiverse's branching possibilities. But in at least some of these futures, adult Meg is a striking figure. Competent, self-possessed, someone who appears to have moved through the hardest years of her life and emerged on the other side of them as a person of considerable capability. The fan community has noted this with a kind of hopeful defiance. The theory holds that Meg's sustained suffering in the show's present is, in some versions of the timeline, not the whole of her story. That the person being treated as worthless in the present is becoming something formidable. That the underground fire that her character contains, the toughness and moral clarity that surfaces in rare episodes when she is written as a person rather than a target, is not going to stay underground forever. In one version of the future, Meg wins. Section 10. The shadow forces what is really running this town. Let us pull the camera back from the Griffin household and the Griffin family and look at the larger picture of what this universe actually contains. Because the show has, over the course of its run, constructed a remarkably elaborate shadow infrastructure operating behind the surface of ordinary American suburban life. An infrastructure of hidden power, institutional corruption, government experimentation, and forces that operate without accountability or visibility in the community's daily life. We have already touched on several elements of this infrastructure. Carter Pewterschmidt's pharmaceutical monopoly and his decision to suppress the cancer cure, the CIA's apparent presence in the community, signaled by the Klaus connection through American Dad, and the sleeper agent network revealed by the Russian Operation episode. The eccentric governance of Mayor Adam West, which may function as a destabilizing mechanism managed from above. But the shadow infrastructure goes deeper than any of these individual pieces. Start with the Pawtucket Patriot Brewery, where Peter works. The brewery has been described at various points as one of the most successful local employers in the region. It produces a beer brand with national distribution. Its owner and founder is a character named Angela, and later other executives whose backstories are never fully developed. The brewery has been involved in multiple storylines involving Peter's employment, but the business itself, its supply chains, its relationships with other local businesses, its financial connections, are never examined. What the show does establish is that the brewery is willing to engage in practices that range from ethically questionable to actively illegal when it serves their interests. Peter has been involved in several schemes at work that clearly violate labor law and basic ethical standards, and the brewery's management consistently prioritizes profit over employee welfare in ways the show treats as background comedy. In the context of a town where the most powerful person is a billionaire who commits mass murder for profit, a local brewery that operates with an unofficial policy of looking the other way on employee misconduct and potentially worse practices fits into the landscape. It is another node in the town's network of institutions that function at the convenience of the powerful, rather than the benefit of the community. Then there is the hospital, Quahog General, and its lead physician, Dr. Hartman. Dr. Hartman is one of the show's most consistently unreliable characters in terms of professional competence. He has misdiagnosed conditions catastrophically, given dangerous advice, performed procedures incorrectly, and demonstrated a level of medical incompetence that should have resulted in his license being revoked many times over. Yet he continues to practice, continues to be the go-to physician for the community, and faces essentially no accountability for his failures. The fan theory that has developed around Dr. Hartman suggests that his incompetence is not random. The show itself offered a hint in the episode where Dr. Hartman mentions having once tried to clone a chicken in his laboratory, which produced a hostile, man-sized chicken that escaped. This is presented as a throwaway gag, but it suggests that Dr. Hartman's medical practice is a cover for something else: laboratory experiments, research that goes well beyond routine medicine. The kind of work that, in a community with a CIA presence and a billionaire willing to conduct pharmaceutical experiments on the population, might be directed rather than spontaneous. What if Ernie the Giant Chicken is not a random or supernatural element of the show's universe? What if he is a failed experiment, escaped from Dr. Hartman's lab, living in the community as a consequence of unauthorized biological research? The show itself gestures toward this possibility when it notes that Hartman tried to clone a chicken and produced a hostile, man-sized result. Ernie is described in the show's lore as essentially unkillable, having survived every encounter with Peter no matter how definitively he appears to have been defeated. This level of physical resilience is consistent with an experimental organism designed with enhanced biological durability. The Ernie question connects back to the Peter question in an interesting way. If Ernie is a product of unauthorized biological research, and if Ernie's sustained feud with Peter is not random but somehow connected to the same network of power that keeps the town running on its strange, consequence-free logic, then the fights between Peter and Ernie are not just comedy set pieces. They are encounters between two elements of the same system, both created or at least shaped by forces that operate above the visible level of the story. Peter, the possibly CIA-managed household anchor. Ernie, the possibly lab-escaped experimental organism. Both invincible, both reset after every encounter. Both returning to the same community and the same patterns, regardless of what the episode's ending appeared to imply. The government presence in the town is not limited to the CIA or to Peter's protection. The show has also established that the military has conducted operations in and around the community, that various federal agencies have taken an interest in the Griffin household specifically, and that certain characters in the show's support cast have backgrounds in government or intelligence work that are never fully explained. Joe Swanson is a police officer who demonstrates capabilities in moments of genuine threat that go far beyond what his day-to-day comedic portrayal would suggest. In episodes where a real threat appears, Joe becomes a genuinely formidable figure. His physical abilities are extraordinary for someone in his condition, and his tactical intelligence and combat skills are consistent with someone who has had significantly more training than a local police officer would typically receive. His background before arriving on Spooner Street is sketched in broad strokes. He was injured one Christmas investigating a robbery at an orphanage. The nature of the injury and the circumstances around it have been told in different versions across different episodes, with the details shifting in ways that suggest the official account is not the complete one. A theory worth considering is that Joe Swanson's placement on Spooner Street is not coincidental, that a man of his capabilities and background was assigned to this specific community for reasons connected to whatever is being managed there. His friendship with Peter, his proximity to the Griffin household, his position as the community's primary law enforcement presence, all fit the profile of a placed asset maintaining oversight of a community that requires monitoring. Whether or not you find that particular theory compelling, the cumulative picture that emerges from examining all of these elements together is one of a community that is far less random than it appears. A community where the eccentric mayor, the incompetent doctor, the criminal billionaire, the surveillance-capable neighbor, and the household with the talking dog and the baby genius and the man who cannot be killed are all connected by a network of institutional power that the show has never drawn as a complete picture. The show does not want you to see the whole picture. It wants you to see the jokes. The jokes are the point. But the world built around the jokes has a structure, and the structure is not innocent. Section 11. Are the cutaways real? The most unusual mystery of all. This section will probably feel different from the others. Because the mystery we are examining here is not about a character's backstory or a plot inconsistency. It is about the fundamental architecture of the show's reality, about a storytelling device that has been used thousands of times across hundreds of episodes, about whether what the audience sees when a Family Guy episode cuts away from the main story is fiction within fiction or something else entirely. The cutaway gag, for those who need a quick reminder of the mechanics, a character says something like, "This is worse than the time I," and the screen cuts to a brief scene showing whatever is being referenced. The scene plays out, and then it cuts back to the main story. Standard format, used in almost every episode, universally familiar to anyone who has spent time with this show. The question that has been discussed in a certain corner of the fan theory community is this: what is the ontological status of what is shown in a cutaway? Is it a memory? Is it a story? Is it a fantasy? Is it real, in the sense that it actually happened in the show's universe at some point? Or is it not real, in the sense that it is just a joke, a stylistic device with no relationship to the show's actual events? The show itself seems to operate on the assumption that cutaways are real in some sense. Characters reference events from cutaways in later episodes as things that genuinely happened. Brian and Stewie have traveled back in time to the events of the pilot episode and treated that reality as real. If memories can be revisited, and if the past is a physical place you can travel to, then events that happened in cutaways are as historically real as anything else in the show's timeline. But here is where it gets strange. Cutaways frequently show Peter doing things that are physically impossible. They show him in places he could not have been at the time suggested. They show him experiencing events from history that predate his birth. They show him meeting celebrities, surviving disasters, participating in cultural moments from decades before his existence. If all of these are real memories, Peter's life has been impossibly full and impossibly long. One response is to say that these are clearly not meant as real memories. They are jokes. The setup phrase, "this reminds me of the time," is just a mechanism to launch a comedy sketch, not a genuine claim about Peter's experience. But then you run into episodes where Peter's cutaway references are later treated as factual by other characters, where the events in cutaways have consequences that extend into subsequent episodes. The line between jokes that happened and jokes that did not happen is drawn inconsistently, and the inconsistency suggests not negligence, but ambiguity. The theory that has been developed around this ambiguity suggests that cutaways in the Family Guy universe are not memories or fantasies at all. They are windows. Brief views into parallel versions of this universe, triggered by the act of making a comparison. When Peter says, "This is worse than the time I," the universe actually opens a viewing window onto another universe where that thing happened. The events in the cutaway are real. They just happened in a different version of reality. This theory is coherent with the multiverse framework we established in Section 7. If parallel universes exist and are accessible, then the cutaway mechanism might be an unconscious manifestation of that access. Characters in this universe can, without knowing how or why, briefly glimpse related events in parallel universes when they draw comparisons. The connection between the main story and the cutaway is not metaphorical. It is dimensional. The cutaway is a real event in a real universe, accessed through the emotional resonance of the comparison being drawn. Under this theory, the most famous and most criticized cutaway gags in the show's history, including the notorious Conway-Twitty sequences where the show simply broadcasts a Conway-Twitty performance with no joke attached, take on a different quality. Those sequences are not lazy writing. They are the cutaway mechanism misfiring. The universe tried to open a window and found something it could not translate into the main story's context, so the window stayed open too long, and the audience had to sit with what was on the other side of it. A country singer performing. A universe where that is what was happening when the comparison was drawn. This might be taking the theory further than it was designed to go, but the core question remains genuinely interesting. What are the cutaways? The show has never answered it. It has never committed to a position on whether its most distinctive storytelling device is fictional or factual within its own universe. And that ambiguity is itself a mystery worth sitting with. There is a related mystery that concerns not the cutaways themselves, but the act of watching them. The Season 10 episode Back to the Pilot contains a moment where Brian and Stewie, having traveled back to the events of the first episode, observe the pilot-era characters standing around doing nothing during a cutaway. The pilot characters are simply frozen. Waiting, not performing their lives, not existing independently, just suspended between moments, paused while the cutaway plays out. The show frames this as a meta-joke about the mechanics of cutaway gags. Characters have to wait somewhere while the show goes elsewhere. But if you are in a theory-oriented frame of mind, it suggests something more interesting. If characters freeze and wait during cutaways, then their experience of time is not continuous. There are gaps in their consciousness, pauses in their experience of being alive, that correspond to the moments when the show looks away from them. What does it feel like to be a character in the Family Guy universe? Do you know about the gaps? Do you have any awareness of the moments when your story is not being told? Is there something on the other side of each cutaway, some experience of non-being, that the characters endure every time Peter Griffin makes a comparison? The show has offered a darkly comedic version of this question in episodes where characters seem to be aware, at the edges of the story, that they exist in a television show. The fourth wall breakages, where characters address the audience directly, are numerous in the later seasons, and they consistently carry a tone that is either playfully self-aware or genuinely distressed, depending on which character is breaking the fourth wall and what they are saying through it. The show has never committed to a position on whether its characters are conscious of their situation, but the evidence that has accumulated across hundreds of episodes and 2 decades of storytelling suggests at minimum that they exist in something more than a simple story. They exist in a universe with its own physics, its own rules, its own historical depth, and that universe, like all the best fictional universes, has more in it than has ever been explained. Section 12. The great unanswered endings, mysteries the show walked away from. We have spent a great deal of time in this exploration examining the deep structural mysteries of the Family Guy universe. The nature of Peter, the origin of Stewie, the truth about Brian, the forces operating behind the surface of the community, the rules of death and time, and the multiverse. But there is a category of mystery that is simpler and in some ways more frustrating than any of these. The mysteries that are not hidden or structural or philosophical. The mysteries that the show simply created and then abandoned. The threads it pulled and then dropped. The questions it raised and then refused to answer. This final section is for those mysteries. The ones where a story was started, a door was opened, and the show simply walked away and never came back. Let us go through them one by one. The first is Peter's twin brother Chip Griffin. In the episode Sibling Rivalry, Peter discovers that he has a twin brother named Chip, who was given up for adoption at birth and who has lived a completely separate life. This is a significant piece of personal backstory for the show's main character. Peter has a twin sibling, a person who shares his DNA who grew up elsewhere while Peter was raised by Thelma and Francis, who represents a version of Peter's life that took a completely different path. Chip Griffin appears in one episode and is never mentioned again. The show does not explore what it means for Peter's understanding of his own identity to know he had a twin. It does not follow up on whether Peter and Chip form any kind of relationship. The mystery of what Chip's life was like, whether the McFinnigan genes shaped him similarly to how they shaped Peter, whether their divergent upbringings produced meaningfully different people, all of it is dropped completely. The second abandoned mystery is the fate of Patrick Pewterschmidt. Lois's brother Patrick was institutionalized by Carter because he was an embarrassment to the family. When Patrick eventually escapes, he is revealed to have become a serial killer who targets fat men, apparently because fat men represent his memory of Peter and the hatred he has developed for what he perceives as Peter's role in separating him from his family. The episode addresses this, resolves the immediate threat, and Patrick is returned to institutional care. But the implications of Patrick's existence are never returned to. Lois has a brother who is a serial killer. Her father effectively created that serial killer by hiding him away instead of getting him help. The Pewterschmidt family has a direct connection to one of the most extreme forms of antisocial behavior. How does Lois feel about this? How does it affect her relationship with her father? How does knowing that her family's decisions produced a murderer influence her own parenting choices? The show gives us one episode and moves on. The tragedy of Patrick Pewterschmidt is deep and specific, and completely unexamined after its introduction. Third, the question of Brian's human son, Dylan. Brian fathered a child with a woman he had a brief relationship with, and the child, named Dylan, has grown into a teenage boy who is troubled and difficult and ultimately reformed through Brian's belated effort at fatherhood. Dylan's arc is genuinely touching in the episode that introduces and largely concludes it. But Dylan, as a person, continues to exist. Brian continues to be his father. What is their relationship after the episode ends? What does Dylan's life look like as he moves into adulthood? The show mentions him occasionally but never commits to following his story in any sustained way. What makes Dylan particularly interesting is that he represents a version of Brian's potential that most of Brian's storylines deny. In his relationship with Dylan, Brian is caring, patient, genuinely invested in another person's well-being. He does the hard work of parenting even though it is inconvenient and forces him to confront his own failures. He is, briefly, the character he always presented himself as being. And then the episode ends, and the next episode, Brian is back to being the version of himself who does terrible things to his friends and has learned nothing. Dylan's existence is a permanent indictment of the later Brian's character. If Brian is capable of being a decent, present, emotionally invested parent when the narrative requires it, then every other episode where he is selfish, callous, and indifferent to the people he claims to care about is not character growth or complexity. It is inconsistency. It is the show using Brian as needed and discarding the evidence when it is inconvenient. Fourth, the Stewie time machine and what it means for the show's future. The show has used the time machine as a plot device numerous times. Brian has been saved by it. Historical events have been altered by it. Parallel universes have been explored with related technology. The time machine as a piece of lore has produced the show's most emotionally and narratively ambitious episodes. Back to the pilot. Road to Germany. Christmas Guy. Some of the most discussed and best remembered hours of Family Guy. But the show has never asked the logical follow-up question. What does the existence of this technology mean in the long run? Stewie has a device that can travel through time and between universes. He has used it to prevent deaths and alter historical events. He is 1 year old and in possession of the most powerful technology in the history of this fictional universe. What is he eventually going to do with it? What is the endpoint of a story in which a baby with unlimited temporal capabilities grows into a child, a teenager, an adult who retains that capability? The show does not ask because the show does not have an endpoint in mind. It continues indefinitely, and the time machine is a tool rather than a narrative commitment. But the mystery remains. Somewhere in the show's future, or in one of its infinite possible futures, there is a version of Stewie who has grown up with full access to time travel. What that version of Stewie does with his life is one of the most genuinely interesting questions the show has ever implicitly raised and most definitively refused to address. Fifth, the truth about the show's version of Rhode Island and the town's relationship to the real state it is set in. The show has always presented the town as a fictional version of an existing place, and it has engaged with Rhode Island's specific culture, geography, and history in ways that are often quite detailed. But the show's town is also clearly not the real place. It is a cartoon approximation, a stage set built to contain a specific kind of story. The tension between the show's real-world anchoring and its clearly fictional physics has never been resolved in any explicit way. And then there is the mystery that lives in the most humble place of all. The mystery of what Peter Griffin's ordinary, unremarkable Tuesday afternoon looks like. Not the episodes, not the adventures, not the fights with the chicken or the feuds with the neighbors or the catastrophes that require a half hour to resolve. Just Tuesday. Peter in his house, watching television, drinking a beer, going to bed. The version of this family's life that exists in the gaps between episodes, that the show never shows because it has no plot and no punchline. But that would be the bulk of their actual experience if they were real. That version of their life is the deepest mystery, because the show has given us 2.5 decades of exceptional events and extraordinary moments and world-breaking consequences that are undone and restored and undone again. But it has never given us the ordinary life underneath all of that. The quiet, the routine. The version of Peter Griffin who is just a man in his house in the evening, with his family around him in whatever complicated way families are around each other, not being remarkable, not surviving anything, just existing in the world that has been constructed around him. That person, that ordinary Peter on a Tuesday, is someone we have never met. And the fact that the show has run for over 25 years and still hasn't shown us that person might be the most interesting mystery of all, because it suggests that the ordinary life is too dangerous to depict. That if you strip away the plot mechanics and the comedy beats and the cutaway gags and the reset button, what you find underneath is something the show cannot look at directly. Maybe it is grief. Maybe it is love. Maybe it is the simple and devastating reality of what it actually means to be a human being living in a house, on a street, in a small city, in a universe that does not care about your problems and does not provide reset buttons and does not always send death to collect you before your time. Maybe the ordinary life of the Griffin family is the most unsettling thing in their entire universe. Or maybe it is simply Tuesday, and some mysteries are allowed to stay that way. Section 13. Quagmire's Impossibilities. The 1 year old question and other gaps. Glenn Quagmire is the neighbor on the left. He is the airline pilot. He is Peter's best friend. He has a catchphrase. He has a complicated relationship with women that the show has handled with varying degrees of awareness over the years. He has a house decorated to evoke the 1950s and 1960s in aesthetic and atmosphere. And according to his driver's license, as revealed in the episode Foxy Lady, he is 61 years old. The problem with Quagmire being 61 years old is that Quagmire does not look, behave, or exist in the show as a person who is 61 years old. He appears to be roughly the same age as Peter, Joe, and Cleveland, who are in their early to mid-40s. His skin is smooth, his body is trim and active. He functions, in every visible way, as a middle-aged man, rather than a man entering his 60s. The show provides an in-universe explanation that is presented as a joke. Quagmire eats carrots, which is why he looks younger than he is. The carrot explanation is obviously not intended seriously, but it gets at something genuinely interesting about Quagmire's situation within the show's universe. If Quagmire is 61, and if he was a young adult, say 18 to 22, in the late 1970s, that means he came of age during the period that his house's aesthetic is designed to evoke, the 1950s and 60s, which would make him not a young adult in the late 1970s, but a child. The math does not quite work even in the show's own terms. Either Quagmire is nostalgic for a period before his own youth, which is unusual but not impossible, or the 1 year old detail was established without full consideration of the implications. The fan community has developed a theory around Quagmire's age that draws on one of the wilder corners of the show's lore. The theory holds that Quagmire is not 61 inches the conventional sense. He is 61 inches the sense that his body has aged 61 years, but his existence as a person, as a consciousness inhabiting that body, is far older. The theory connects to the reincarnation framework sometimes applied to Stewie, suggesting that Quagmire is also a reincarnated or cosmically ancient soul occupying a human body that is currently, in this cycle, 61 years old. The show itself has offered one piece of evidence that is frequently cited in this context. A palm reading by a character named Madame Claude tells Quagmire that he was Jack the Ripper in a past life. This is treated as a comedy moment, but it places Quagmire explicitly in the category of characters with a past that predates their current existence. He has lived before. Whatever he did or experienced in that previous existence left enough of an impression that it is readable in his palm across time. Jack the Ripper, as Quagmire's past identity, is, of course, designed as a dark joke about Quagmire's complicated relationship with women. The Ripper killed women. Quagmire treats women as objects for his own gratification. The parallel is uncomfortable and clearly intentional on the writer's part, but it also establishes, within the show's own logic, that Quagmire has a history of harm toward women that extends back into Victorian London. That whatever he is doing in his current existence is not new behavior. It is a pattern that predates this life. This raises a troubling question about the nature of moral growth in a universe where consciousness can be reincarnated. If you spend one life as a serial killer, and then you are reincarnated, do you carry the tendency with you? Does the next body inherit the previous one's darkness, muted and modulated but still present? Does Quagmire know, on some level he cannot consciously access, what he did before? Is that knowledge part of what drives the particular quality of his behavior in his current life? These are questions that the show would never take seriously enough to answer, but they live in the lore that has been accumulated, in the throwaway lines and the brief reveals, and the moments where the comedy is clearly a cover for something that the writers found more interesting than they wanted to fully commit to. Quagmire's relationship with his father, who underwent a gender transition and became Ida Davis, is one of the most genuinely complicated pieces of character backstory in the show. The episode Quagmire's Dad handles the revelation in ways that were both ahead of their time in some respects, and deeply clumsy in others. But what it establishes is that Quagmire came from a household that contained more complexity and contradiction than his surface persona would suggest. His father's hidden identity is the kind of secret that, if the show were interested in seriously developing Quagmire as a character, would be the foundation for exploring why he is the way he is. What does it mean to grow up with a parent who was suppressing a fundamental aspect of their identity? What does that teach you, consciously and unconsciously, about authenticity and performance and the gap between who you present yourself as and who you actually are? Quagmire's entire persona, the relentless sexual bravado, the smooth operator front, the house that looks like a set from another era, all of it could be read as a performance. A personality constructed to never have to be vulnerable. A character developed by a person who learned early that your family could contain secrets that would change everything if they came out. The show does not develop this, but the ingredients are there. The unsolved mystery of what Glenn Quagmire actually is, underneath the catchphrase, underneath the bravado, underneath the 6-1-year-old carrot-eating exterior, is one of the show's richest unexplored territories. Then there is the question of why Quagmire hates Brian with such intensity. His speech in the episode Jerome is the New Black, where he delivers a comprehensive and pointed account of everything wrong with Brian's character, is one of the most discussed moments in the show's later seasons. It is sharp, it is accurate. Everything Quagmire says is backed by actual events in the show's history. Brian is a fraud. Brian is pretentious. Brian is a bad father. Brian constantly hits on his best friend's wife. All true. But there is something in the intensity of Quagmire's hatred that goes beyond simple, justified frustration. He does not just dislike Brian. He despises him with a depth of feeling that seems disproportionate even to Brian's many genuine failings. The theory that has developed around this is that Quagmire sees in Brian a mirror he cannot tolerate. That Brian's specific combination of pretending to be something better than he is while doing things he claims to be above is a pattern that Quagmire recognizes in himself and despises in himself, and that seeing it in Brian is like being Brian his own reflection. Under this reading, Quagmire's loathing of Brian is a form of self-loathing projected outward. The things he hates most in Brian are the things he knows most clearly in himself. And the intensity of his hatred is the intensity of a man who needs to believe he is fundamentally different from the person he is looking at, because the alternative is too uncomfortable to sit with. This is not a mystery the show will ever resolve, but it is the kind of reading that makes a character considerably more interesting than their surface comedy role would suggest. And it is the kind of reading that the Family Guy universe enables, despite, or perhaps because of, the fact that the show has never committed to taking its own characters this seriously. Section 14. The remaining mysteries, all the things we still don't know. We have covered an enormous amount of ground in this exploration, and yet there are mysteries we have touched on only briefly, and others we have not yet reached at all. The Family Guy universe is deeper than any single exploration can fully map, and the questions it leaves open are numerous enough that this section could be its own extended journey. Let us move through the remaining significant unsolved questions as thoroughly as time allows. The question of Bonnie Swanson's pregnancy. Joe Swanson's wife Bonnie was visibly pregnant for approximately 9 seasons of the show. This is one of the most frequently cited continuity issues in the series. She was pregnant when she was introduced. She remained pregnant through season after season of real-world time that passed while the characters experienced only a few years within the story. The pregnancy is impossible by any reasonable biological calculation. It lasted far longer than human gestation allows. The show eventually delivered the baby, Susie, and then the pregnancy was over. But why did it take so long? The simplest answer is that the writers forgot about her or couldn't agree on what to do with a new baby character, and so her pregnancy just persisted in the background as an ignored fact. But the more interesting reading asks what it means, within the universe's physics, for a pregnancy to last that long. If the show's time is genuinely elastic, if years pass within the story while only months pass in the character's perception, then Bonnie's pregnancy might not be as unusual as it appears. In a universe where the timeline is fluid and experience does not map consistently onto calendar time, a pregnancy that begins and does not end for years might simply be the product of time moving differently for different characters at different moments. The question of Chris Griffin's hidden depths is another significant gap in the show's exploration of its own characters. Chris is presented almost entirely as a gentle, dim-witted teenager with a habit of saying inappropriate things. His main character trait, as the show has used it, is his lack of sophistication combined with occasional surprising insight. He has a talent for visual art that has been referenced several times and then mostly dropped. He has a relationship with an inner demon, literally depicted in one episode as a small, dark creature that lives inside his closet and gives him terrible advice that is never explained in terms of where it came from or what it represents about Chris's psychology. The demon in Chris's closet, if taken seriously as a piece of lore rather than a one-off comedy device, suggests that Chris is dealing with something darker than his surface persona implies. Every person has an inner critic, an inner voice that pushes them toward bad decisions. But most people's inner critics are not literal creatures that live in their bedroom furniture. The fact that Chris's is externalized in this way, visible and interactive, suggests either that Chris has an unusually strong relationship with his own darker impulses, or that the show's universe contains some mechanism by which psychological states can be made physically manifest. This connects to a broader mystery about the show's universe. Where do its many strange, inexplicable entities come from? The giant chicken, the demon in Chris's closet, death and his operating practices, the various supernatural beings and impossible creatures that pass through the Griffin family's life with no explanation. The universe is populated by things that should not exist under any coherent set of physical laws, and the show has never offered a unifying explanation for any of them. One approach to this mystery is the Hell theory. This theory, developed in multiple versions by different parts of the fan community, proposes that the Griffin family and their neighbors are not living in a real physical world at all. They are in hell, or, in a more merciful interpretation, in purgatory. The impossible creatures, the inexplicable entities, the lack of genuine consequences, the way suffering persists without healing and cruelty cycles without accountability, all of it is consistent with a supernatural realm rather than a natural one. The characters are not a family. They are souls, trapped in eternal repetition of their worst qualities, unable to grow or change or escape, experiencing their sins as an ongoing situation rather than a past event. The evidence for this theory is scattered throughout the show, more in the feeling of it than in specific provable moments. But the structure of the show, the way it cycles through the same dynamics repeatedly with no lasting change, does have the quality of a place where time has stopped and consequences have been replaced by repetition, where suffering is not meaningful but is instead simply the operating condition of the space. The Hell theory becomes more interesting when you consider the purgatory variation, which holds that change is possible but extraordinarily difficult, and that the occasional episodes where characters genuinely grow, where Meg stands up for herself, where Peter expresses real love, where Brian helps someone selflessly, are not glitches or exceptions, but moments of genuine progress in a soul's long journey towards something better, rare, insufficient in isolation, but real, and adding up, somewhere in the infinite accounting of this universe, toward an eventual exit. One mystery that the show introduced and then handled in a way that disappointed many fans is the fate of Bertram. Stewie's nemesis and half-brother, Bertram is the product of a sperm donation that Peter made in a hospital, which was used to conceive a child who grew up to be Stewie's intellectual equal and opposite. The dynamic between Stewie and Bertram was one of the most genuinely interesting things the show ever developed, because it offered Stewie a peer, someone who matched his intelligence, who understood the stakes of what he was doing, who could engage with his plans at the level they were actually operating. Bertram was killed. In a time travel episode, a young Bertram in the past is killed by Stewie to prevent a series of future events. Stewie kills his own brother. And then Bertram is gone from the show completely. The loss of Bertram as a character is mourned in certain parts of the fan community, not because he was lovable, because he was often actively hostile and cruel, but because he was one of the few characters in the show's universe who gave Stewie a genuinely worthy opponent. With Bertram gone, Stewie's potential for villainy has no external mirror, no one to push back against him at the level he operates at. The time travel storyline in which Bertram died felt like a significant thinning of the show's universe. The question of what Bertram's life would have looked like had he survived remains one of the most interesting hypotheticals in the show's history. Two half-brothers of extraordinary intelligence, one dedicated to the world and one dedicated to his own glory, meeting regularly in the ordinary suburban world they both inhabit. What kind of escalating conflict would that have become? What would the universe look like if Stewie had a genuine intellectual rival who shared half his genetics and none of his affections? We will never know. The show killed him, reset the timeline, and moved on. And here we arrive at the essential truth about the Family Guy universe and its mysteries. The show is not designed to resolve them. It is designed to accumulate them, to add layer upon layer of unexplained detail and dropped thread and raised question, until the universe underneath the comedy becomes so dense and complex that it rewards the kind of prolonged attention most television is not meant to receive. The mysteries are not accidents. They are not the result of poor planning or lazy writing, though those things contributed to some of them. They are the residue of a universe that was built quickly, revised constantly, expanded without a blueprint, and populated by characters whose potential was often only half realized, even by the people creating them. And that residue, those questions that were left open and those threads that were never followed, those dark corners that the show walked into and then tiptoed away from, is where the most interesting version of the Family Guy universe lives. Not in the episodes themselves, but in the space between them. In the things the show suggested and chose not to say. Section 15. The Final Mystery. What is the house on Spooner Street? We end where we began. On Spooner Street. In front of the house that has survived every catastrophe the show's writers could throw at it, that has been burned and flooded and exploded and invaded and occupied and rebuilt and reset, and that sits at the same address every week looking exactly the same as it always has. The house on Spooner Street is not just a setting, it is the fixed point around which the entire Family Guy universe orbits. The people inside it might be criminals or cowards or broken versions of themselves or possibly not even people in the ordinary sense. The universe surrounding it might be a simulation or a dream or a hell or a purgatory or an honest-to-goodness living, breathing fictional world with a physics that simply refuses to behave. The forces that operate behind the neighborhood surface might be corporate or governmental or supernatural or none of the above, but the house stays. There is something in that persistence that feels meaningful even if the show never intended it to. A house that cannot be destroyed. A family that cannot be truly separated. A story that cannot truly end, because the moment you think it has ended, it comes back, rebuilt, the same address, the same faces, the same fundamental arrangement of love and dysfunction and terrible decisions and occasional grace. What is the house on Spooner Street? It is a mystery. One that has been running since the 31st of January, 1999, when 22 million people watched a cartoon family introduce themselves to the world and invited a universe of questions in through the door with them. And the best thing about a mystery that good is that you get to keep thinking about it. If you have made it all the way to the end of this exploration, I want to genuinely thank you for spending this much time here with these ideas. This kind of deep dive is the thing I love making most. And knowing that there are people out there who want to spend 3 hours thinking carefully about a cartoon universe means everything for what this channel is doing. If you enjoyed this video, please subscribe and leave a comment below telling me which mystery from this exploration you find most fascinating. Is it Stewie's origin? The multiverse theory? The question of what Peter really is? Brian's CIA connection? I want to hear your thinking. If there is a specific Family Guy lore question you want me to explore in even more depth in a future video, leave that in the comments too. Some of the topics we touched on tonight could easily become their own standalone explorations. Thank you for watching, thank you for being part of this community, and I will see you in the next one. End of script. Total word count target, 30,000 plus words. Channel, Uncle Guy Lore. Topic, 3 hours of unsolved Family Guy mysteries plus theories. Bonus Section 1. The Lois Griffin Enigma, the woman the show forgot to explain. There is a version of Family Guy where Lois Griffin is the most fascinating and dangerous character in the entire story. The show hints at this version of Lois repeatedly, in scattered moments across dozens of episodes, before consistently retreating from the implications. And the result is that Lois remains one of the most tantalizing and fundamentally underexplored mysteries in the whole universe. let us establish what we actually know about her. Lois is the daughter of Carter and Barbara Pewterschmidt, born into extraordinary wealth and privilege. She grew up in the kind of household that has staff and estates and social obligations that most people never encounter. She was educated, polished, socially sophisticated in ways that her husband is definitively not. She plays piano beautifully. She speaks with the kind of measured diction that comes from careful upbringing. She married a man who works at a brewery, not because he was her social equal, but presumably because of something she felt for him that overrode the calculations of her family's world. But here is what makes Lois interesting when you look more carefully. Her past contains depths that the show has revealed in glimpses and then never fully examined. In earlier seasons, Lois is revealed to have a genuinely reckless young adulthood. She was not always the patient, piano-teaching suburban mother. She had encounters, relationships, experiences that the buttoned-up present version of her character seems designed to contain rather than reflect. She was apparently in a relationship with the frontman of a major rock band at some point, a fact delivered as a joke in a cutaway, but one that has the quality of genuine character information. Not because any celebrity specifically matters, but because what it tells us is that young Lois moved through a world that was considerably wilder and more hedonistic than the one she inhabits in the show's present. The woman who married Peter Griffin was not always the woman she is when we meet her. Something happened in her late teens and 20s that the show has never fully unpacked. There is also the extraordinary fact, quietly introduced and just as quietly dropped, that Lois has a history of kleptomania. There is an episode in which it is revealed that Lois has struggled with compulsive theft, that this is a genuine psychological condition she has dealt with for years, and that it connects to unresolved issues around her childhood and her relationship with her parents. The episode addresses the condition, reaches some kind of resolution, and then the kleptomania is almost never referenced again. As if the show opened a window into Lois's psychology that was much more interesting and complicated than the show wanted to maintain. What the kleptomania reveals, if you take it seriously as characterization rather than as a comedic device, is that Lois has coped with her life through compulsive behavior. That the controlled, composed exterior she presents is maintained at cost, and that when the cost gets too high, something in her reaches out and takes what it wants, without asking permission. That is a psychologically specific portrait of a person who has been suppressing herself for a very long time. Add to this the episode where Lois, after a series of circumstances, discovers that she has a genuine talent and appetite for competitive fighting. She trains, she competes, she wins, and she reveals a capacity for aggression that sits in stark contrast to the patient mother persona she typically wears. The episode resolves by returning her to her ordinary life, but the capacity stays. It does not go away just because the plot no longer needs it. Somewhere inside Lois Griffin is a fighter who has been choosing the piano and the homework help and the patient sighing over Peter's nonsense, when she could have been something else entirely. This is the version of Lois that the most thoughtful fan reading finds beneath the surface. A woman of enormous capability and suppressed wildness who made choices, for reasons we are never given full access to, that locked her into a particular life at a particular address with a particular husband, and who maintains that life with a discipline that occasionally slips, revealing the person she might have been if different choices had been made. Her relationship with Peter is the central mystery of her character, because from the outside, from the perspective of her family background and her demonstrated capabilities, the marriage to Peter makes no obvious sense. Carter Pewterschmidt is not wrong to be confused by it, even if his response to the confusion is awful. Peter is not Lois's intellectual equal. He is not her social equal. He is not stable or responsible or capable of providing the kind of security that someone from her background might reasonably expect. So why did she choose him? The show's answer, delivered in various flashbacks, is that she loved him. That there was a genuineness and a warmth in Peter that she did not find in the polished, calculating men of her family's social circle. That he was real in ways that other options were not. This is a romantic reading that the show endorses fully, and it has the quality of truth, because the early seasons do show a genuine and tender connection between Peter and Lois that the later seasons largely abandoned. But there is another reading that the fan community has developed, one that the show's own structure supports, even if it never explicitly endorses. The reading is that Lois chose Peter partly as an exit strategy. Not because she did not feel something for him, but because she understood that marrying Peter was the cleanest available escape from her father's world. Carter Pewterschmidt is a man who controlled everything around him, including his family. A daughter who married a man of comparable status and wealth would remain in Carter's orbit, subject to his influence and his demands. A daughter who married a man like Peter, who was definitively not of Carter's world, could live a life that Carter would condescend to and therefore not need to control. The marriage to Peter is, under this reading, a form of escape. A managed exit from a household that produced a serial killer son, that had affairs and concealed marriages and suppressed fundamental realities about its members, that sat on a cure for cancer and poisoned towns with chemical waste. Lois got out. She got out in the most complete way available to her, by choosing someone her father could not absorb or manage. And then she built a life in that escape, a genuinely new life with its own complications and its own loves and its own failures. This does not make Lois calculating in a cold or predatory sense. It makes her smart. Smart in the way that people who grew up in difficult households learn to be smart, which is to say strategically, always maintaining awareness of the exits. She felt something for Peter, that is real. But she also made a choice that happened to align with what she felt. Both things can be true. The tragedy of Lois, in this reading, is that she escaped one kind of difficult situation and stepped into another one. The household on Spooner Street, while genuinely her own and genuinely loved, is still a household, still a set of obligations and constraints, still a life in which her own extraordinary capabilities are mostly submerged beneath the daily requirements of maintaining a family that runs at a much lower octane than she could manage. The show has never told this version of Lois's story. It has only left the ingredients sitting in the pantry, visible if you know what to look for, never assembled into the dish they could make. And so Lois Griffin remains one of the show's deepest mysteries. Not because we know nothing about her, but because everything we know about her points toward a more interesting version of herself that the show was never quite willing to fully create. Bonus Section 2. The chicken fights every detail you may have missed. Let us slow down and give extended attention to something that has become so normalized in the Family Guy universe that it barely registers as strange anymore. The fact that Peter Griffin has a violent, nearly lethal, decade-spanning feud with a giant anthropomorphic chicken named Ernie. This is extraordinary. This is, objectively, one of the strangest ongoing storylines in the history of American animated television. And the show has handled it with such deadpan consistency that the strangeness has been somewhat smoothed over by familiarity. Let us restore the strangeness. Let us look at what the chicken fights actually are and what they mean. The feud began, as established in the Season 2 episode Da Boom, when Ernie gave Peter an expired coupon. That is it. That is the full origin of a conflict that has resulted in massive property destruction, civilian casualties, and what appear to be multiple near deaths for both participants. One expired coupon. Peter's reaction was not to complain to a manager or throw the coupon away. He attacked the chicken. He attacked a creature significantly larger than himself, one that is clearly capable of inflicting serious harm because of a coupon that had passed its redemption date. The disproportionality of Peter's response is the first mystery. Normal human beings do not respond to minor commercial disappointments by assaulting giant poultry, but Peter does not hesitate. There is something in him that, when provoked at even the most minor level, produces a response that is completely disconnected from the scale of the provocation. This is either a profound character revelation, that Peter operates on a hair trigger that has nothing to do with the specific provocation and everything to do with something deeper in his psychology, or it is evidence that the coupon incident is not actually the origin of the feud. That the fight Peter launches into was already waiting to happen, and the expired coupon was simply the occasion that released it. Some fans have proposed that Peter and Ernie were enemies before the coupon, that the coupon incident was a kind of reset point, a moment from which the feud could be explained to newcomers, but that the actual enmity between them predates it, possibly from a previous life, under the reincarnation framework we discussed earlier, possibly from a previous cycle of the show's universe. If the multiverse theory is correct and versions of these characters have met and fought across multiple iterations, the feud does not feel like a first encounter. It feels like a resumption. Ernie himself is one of the show's most opaque characters. He has a wife named Nicole, which was revealed in an episode where Peter and Ernie's feud paused briefly and they had dinner together. He has children. He has a social existence outside of his encounters with Peter. He is not purely a monster or a villain. He is a person, or a person-adjacent entity, who has his own life in this community and who returns to violence with Peter on a semi-regular basis. The survival issue is the biggest mystery associated with the chicken fights. Both Peter and Ernie sustain damage in these battles that should be fatal many times over. They fall from enormous heights. They are crushed by falling structures. They are submerged in water, exposed to fire, thrown through concrete. Each encounter ends with one of them apparently dead, and then the next encounter reveals that they survived. Ernie is specifically described in the show's extended lore as essentially invincible, an entity that cannot be killed by conventional means. Dr. Hartman's aside about having once accidentally created a hostile man-sized chicken in a cloning experiment, which we discussed in the Shadow Forces section, is the show's only direct attempt at an explanation. If Ernie is a laboratory creation, his impossible resilience might be the result of experimental enhancement. He was designed with biological systems that are more durable than natural ones. He heals faster, he absorbs more damage. He is not just a large chicken in the way that natural chickens are large. He is something more specifically constructed. But if Ernie is Dr. Hartman's creation, several follow-up questions arise. Does Hartman know that Ernie is alive in the community? Does he track his creation's activities? Is Ernie's recurrent engagement with Peter part of some experimental protocol, or has Ernie genuinely gone rogue from whatever purpose Hartman had for him? The show's one moment of hint on this subject was clearly not designed to be followed up on, but it exists. The structural role that the chicken fights play within the show's universe deserves attention in its own right. These fights are the show's most extravagant physical comedy sequences. They are extended, cinematic, elaborate set pieces that take the characters through the town in increasingly inventive ways. They destroy things. They affect background characters in the environment as Peter and Ernie crash through populated spaces. The show resets after every fight. No investigations. No lasting wreckage. The neighborhood absorbs the catastrophe and returns to baseline. Under the simulation theory, this reset is the universe's maintenance function at work, restoring environmental state after a disruptive process completes. Under the mental institution theory, the fights are violent, intrusive imaginings in a grieving mind that cannot sustain consequences because the mind generating them cannot afford to take those consequences seriously. The thing about the chicken fights that no fan theory fully resolves is the relationship between the fights and Peter's emotional state at the moment they begin. Pay close attention to the context in which Ernie appears. He tends to show up when Peter is in the middle of something else, often something going relatively well or at least moving forward. The chicken appears and Peter stops everything, drops whatever he was doing, and engages completely. The world outside the fight stops mattering. There is only the fight. This is the behavior of someone for whom the fight provides something that ordinary life does not. Relief? Possibly. A context in which the rules are clear. You are enemies, you fight, one of you wins for now, and then it resets. There are no moral complications in the chicken fight. There is no guilt about Meg, no awareness of Brian's judgment, no complexity in the relationship with Lois. There is just the fight, immediate and total and consuming. Peter's relationship with Ernie might be the most honest relationship he has. It is the one in which his nature is most fully expressed. Not the loving father, not the hapless husband, not the loyal friend. The man who will throw everything aside when a specific kind of provocation appears and pursue it to whatever end the universe allows. Which is, apparently, no end at all. Just the fight continuing, just the two of them, finding each other again. Bonus Section 3. The show's relationship with its own past meta-mysteries. Family Guy is one of the few long-running shows in television history that has become increasingly, and sometimes painfully, aware of itself. The fourth wall has been breached so many times in the later seasons that what was once a rare and effective comedic device has become almost a default mode for certain kinds of jokes. Characters reference the show's declining quality. They acknowledge that they are in a television show. They make jokes about the network, about the writers, about the specific situations that have made the show a target for criticism. But this self-awareness creates its own set of mysteries. Because a show that is aware of itself, that can acknowledge its own existence within its own fiction, is a show that has a peculiar relationship with reality. The characters in Family Guy, when they break the fourth wall, are not just making jokes. They are claiming some form of consciousness about their own situation. And that claim, if you take it even a fraction seriously, raises questions about what that consciousness is and what it knows. Consider the episode Brian and Stewie, which stands apart from virtually every other episode in the show's history as an experiment in pure character study. Brian and Stewie are locked in a bank vault together overnight. There are no cutaways. There are no external plot developments. It is two characters, in a room, talking. And in those conversations, Brian reveals that he keeps a loaded gun in a safety deposit box in that very vault, because there have been times when he considered ending his own life. This is handled in the show as a character revelation about Brian's hidden despair beneath his bravado, and Stewie responds with genuine vulnerability of his own, expressing how much Brian means to him. It is one of the most honest and quietly moving pieces of writing in the show's entire run. It treats both characters with a care and seriousness that most episodes do not afford them, and it reveals a depth of feeling in Brian and in Stewie's love for his friend that recontextualizes everything else about them. What this episode establishes is that underneath Brian's insufferable surface in the later seasons, there is a person who genuinely suffers, whose pretensions and failures and arrogance are the armor of someone in real pain rather than simply the character flaws of a badly written sitcom dog. The episode makes the case that Brian is not insufferable because the writers became lazy, but because he became hollow, and that hollowness has a cost that he feels in ways he mostly hides. The show never integrated this revelation into Brian's ongoing characterization in any sustained way. He comes close to that vulnerability in a few subsequent episodes, but the emotional truth of the bank vault conversation fades back into the show's general texture. This is the show's most significant piece of genuine psychological depth, being handled as a one-off rather than as a foundation for something more lasting. The meta-awareness of the show also manifests in a recurring pattern where the show acknowledges problems with itself and then continues to have those problems. Characters will comment on how the cutaways have taken over. They will note that certain jokes have gone on too long. They will reference creative patterns that fans and critics have identified. And then the next scene will contain all the things that were just acknowledged. This creates a specific kind of narrative suspension. The show knows what is wrong with it. The characters know, at some level of awareness, that their world is not functioning the way it should. And yet the knowing does not produce change. The awareness of the problem does not solve the problem. The universe continues on its established path regardless of what any of its inhabitants understand about it. There is a theory in certain philosophy of fiction circles, not specifically about Family Guy, but applicable to it, about what happens when a fictional universe becomes aware of its own fictionality. The theory holds that such awareness, if genuinely entertained, would be destabilizing to the point of incoherence. A character who truly knows they are a character should not be able to function. The knowledge would dissolve the fiction from within. The fact that Family Guy's characters can acknowledge their fictional status and then continue their fictional lives suggests that their awareness is partial and protective. They can gesture toward the truth without fully grasping it. Under this reading, the fourth wall breaks in Family Guy are not actually breaks at all. They are the characters' way of approaching a knowledge they cannot fully hold, touching it briefly in the form of a joke, and then pulling back to the safety of the story. The joke is the protective layer. The humor is the mechanism by which the too muchness of knowing is discharged at a manageable level, leaving enough distance from the truth that the story can continue. This is, perhaps, what all comedy ultimately is. A mechanism for approaching truths that would be difficult at full exposure. A way of saying something real while maintaining the ability to retreat from it. Family Guy, at its best, has always understood this. Its most memorable moments are the ones where something genuine is being touched through the comedy rather than avoided by it. And its most interesting mysteries are the ones where the comedy is the last layer over something that the show was never quite willing to say directly. The mystery of what Family Guy is trying to say, underneath all the jokes and the cutaways and the reset buttons and the expired coupons and the impossible baby and the talking dog and the house that will not stay destroyed, is perhaps the deepest mystery the show contains. It is not a mystery that can be solved by research or by assembling the facts of the show's lore into a coherent theory. It is a mystery that lives in the feeling you get after watching a great early episode of the show when it was still operating at the height of what it could do. There is something in those early episodes that the later seasons cannot fully replicate. Not just better writing, though the writing was better. Not just more consistent characterization, though the characters were more consistent. Something harder to name. A quality of genuine feeling underneath the comedy. A sense that the story was being told by people who cared about these characters, who found them genuinely interesting, who wanted to spend time with them and wanted you to as well. That quality is what long-running shows lose, eventually, most of them. The early energy that came from having something to say and wanting to say it well. The later seasons replace it with professionalism, with familiarity, with the machine of production delivering something adequate and sometimes surprising, but rarely achieving the feeling that the early seasons had of discovering something new. The mystery of Family Guy is the mystery of that feeling. Where it came from, where it went, whether it is still somewhere in the show, buried under the decades of additional material, visible in occasional episodes when everything aligns the right way. It is a mystery with no answer that can be stated in words. But it is the mystery that sits underneath all the other mysteries this exploration has examined. The reason the theories exist. The reason the contradictions are worth examining. The reason a show about a cartoon family in a fictional Rhode Island town has generated this much sustained attention and care from the people who grew up with it. Because something in it early on touched something real. And the question of what that something was, and whether it is still there waiting to be found, is a mystery worth 3 hours of anyone's time. Bonus Section 4. Characters who vanished the mystery of the missing. Family Guy has had an unusually large number of recurring and semi-recurring characters who appeared, established a presence, and then quietly disappeared from the show without explanation. This is not unusual for a long-running television series. But the frequency with which it has happened in this show, and the occasionally significant roles these characters played before their disappearance, creates a distinct category of mystery. Let us look at some of the most notable vanishing acts in the show's history. Brian had a girlfriend named Jillian for a significant stretch of the show's middle seasons. She was portrayed as genuinely kind, good-natured, and not particularly intellectually sophisticated, but she had a real and sincere affection for Brian. Their relationship, while comedic in how it handled the intelligence gap between them, had a thread of genuine warmth that gave Brian some of his most likable moments in that period of the show. When the relationship ended and Jillian moved on, Brian was genuinely affected in a way the show rarely allowed him to be affected by romantic endings. Jillian's departure from the regular cast matters because she represented a period when Brian's romantic life was given enough space to feel real. The questions that relationship raised, about what Brian is and what he wants, and whether what he wants can actually be achieved given what he is, were questions that her presence kept alive. When she left, those questions went with her, and the show lost a consistent source of genuine feeling in Brian's storylines. The departure and return of Cleveland Brown tells its own story about the show's relationship with its own universe. Cleveland leaves in a send-off episode, starts a new life with a new show, and then returns when that show concludes. His reintegration into the Spooner Street group is handled without much interrogation of what the absence meant or what the return changes. He is simply back. The years away are not a weight that the character carries visibly. More interesting is the figure of Muriel Goldman, the Jewish mother of Mort Goldman. Muriel died in an episode, and her death has been treated as permanent within the show's continuity, which is unusual given the show's general relationship with mortality. The loss of Muriel is rarely acknowledged in subsequent episodes, and Mort continues his existence without her. The weight of specific grief, the way a particular person's absence changes the texture of daily life, is something the show has almost entirely declined to explore. Then there is the enormous mystery surrounding Kevin Swanson, Joe's son. Kevin was mentioned early in the show as Joe's son from before Joe's injury. He was referenced as having died in the Iraq War. Kevin then appeared as a character, alive, having faked his death. And then Kevin largely disappeared from the regular cast as well. His reappearance and the questions it raised about his survival essentially dropped in subsequent seasons. Joe's family dynamics are one of the most consistently underdeveloped mysteries in the show. He has a wife whose pregnancy lasted 9 impossible seasons. He has a son who faked his death in a war. He has a daughter, Susie, whose inner monologue is voiced by Patrick Stewart, which is either a random comedy choice or one of the strangest pieces of possible foreshadowing in the show's history. If the shared universe connection between Family Guy and American Dad has any meaningful depth, and if the Patrick Stewart voice connection means something about what is inside Susie Swanson's mind, then the small child of the police officer on Spooner Street has an interior consciousness that is connected to something significant. The show has never investigated this possibility. Characters who vanished. Characters whose endings were never explained. Characters whose deaths were treated as permanent in a universe where almost nothing else is. Characters whose relationships and histories were established and then dropped. The roll call of the missing in Family Guy is long, and each name on that list is a thread that was pulled and left hanging. The mystery is not any single disappearance, but the accumulation of them. What does it tell us about a universe when its inhabitants keep fading out of it without explanation? Is it simply the economics of television production? Characters being written out when their usefulness to the story runs dry? Or is it something the universe itself is doing? Something in the way this world manages its population, deciding who persists and who fades? In a universe built on a reset mechanism, fading might be the gentle version of removal. Not gone, exactly. Just no longer summoned. The character still exists somewhere in the infinite possible states of the multiverse, still living their life in some branch of the timeline, still in some version of events, having breakfast on Spooner Street or at the Drunken Clam or in whatever space was theirs. The Family Guy universe contains, somewhere in its depths, every version of every character who was ever briefly visible and then lost. Every person Brian loved and let go. Every child who appeared and then aged out of the story. Every neighbor who moved without explanation. Every friend of Peter's who came to a barbecue in Season 3 and was never seen again. All of them are out there, in the multiverse. Living in the parallel versions where their stories continued, where the show bothered to follow them, where the camera stayed on them long enough to see what happened next. And maybe that is the most generous reading of the Family Guy universe available to us. Not a fixed, declining, loop-bound world, but a place with so much life in it that no single version of the story can contain it all. A place where every person who ever appeared, however briefly, has a full existence that extends beyond the frame of what any camera could capture. The show only ever showed us one version of Spooner Street, one version of this family, one set of years in an infinite set of possible years. And in every other version, in every other timeline running parallel to the one we watched, there are different answers to every question we asked tonight. That is the final mystery. That is the one that sits underneath all the others. Not what the show told us, but what it could not tell us. Not the answers it offered, but the infinite possible answers existing in all the versions of itself it never showed. The house on Spooner Street is real, in more ways than one version of events can contain. If you have made it all the way to the end of this exploration, I want to genuinely thank you for spending this much time here with these ideas. This kind of deep dive is the thing I love making most, and knowing that there are people out there who want to spend 3 hours thinking carefully about a cartoon universe means everything for what this channel is doing. If you enjoyed this video, please subscribe and leave a comment below telling me which mystery from this exploration you find most fascinating. Is it Stewie's origin? The multiverse theory? The question of what Peter really is? Brian's CIA connection? The truth about Meg? I want to hear your thinking. If there is a specific Family Guy lore question you want me to explore in even more depth in a future video, leave that in the comments too. Some of the topics we touched on tonight could easily become their own standalone explorations. Thank you for watching, thank you for being part of this community, and I will see you in the next one. End of script. Channel, Uncle Guy Lore. Topic: 3 hours of unsolved Family Guy mysteries plus theories. Bonus section 5. The deeper lore. 20 smaller mysteries worth sitting with. Every major exploration like this one inevitably leaves smaller mysteries scattered around the edges, individual threads that do not quite build into a full section on their own, but that deserve acknowledgement. This is the collection of those threads. 20 mysteries, smaller in scale but not in interest, that the Family Guy universe has introduced and never resolved. The first is the question of exactly how Stewie built his first time machine. The show presents it as established fact that Stewie constructed a time machine in his bedroom at some point during the early seasons, but the mechanics of that construction are never explained. Where did a 1-year-old baby get the components? How did he acquire the knowledge to put them together? The evil genius premise explains that he has the intelligence to design such a device, but intelligence alone does not provide access to materials and manufacturing tools. Someone or something must have helped Stewie get what he needed. The show has never asked who. The second is the nature of Peter's relationship with beer specifically. Not just alcohol, but Pawtucket Patriot Ale in particular. Peter's attachment to this specific product is almost devotional in quality, and the brewery where he works is not merely his employer but seems to function as a kind of second home. The question of whether Peter's relationship with the brewery constitutes something more than employment, whether the brewery has any hold on him that goes beyond his paycheck, has been touched on in various storylines but never examined directly. The third mystery concerns the full history of the Spooner Street neighborhood before the Griffins arrived. The show occasionally offers glimpses of the neighborhood's past, but these glimpses are fragmentary and inconsistent. Who lived in the Griffin house before them? The show has suggested various things about the house's history, but never produced a coherent account of what the space was before Peter and Lois moved in. The fourth is the question of what happened to all the other sperm donation children. In one episode, it is revealed that Peter made numerous sperm donations that were used to produce children, meaning there are potentially dozens of Peter Griffin's biological offspring scattered throughout the country. The show acknowledges this with a joke and then moves on. But the implications are significant. Those children exist. They are walking around somewhere with Peter's genetics, completely unaware of their origin. What their lives are like, how many of them there are, and whether the universe's strange physics that seem to operate around Peter also operate around them in any way, are questions the show opened and immediately closed. The fifth mystery involves the actual rules governing who can hear Stewie. The show has been wildly inconsistent on this throughout its run. In the early seasons, almost no one could hear or understand Stewie's elaborate speeches. Brian was the exception. By the middle seasons, more characters were clearly responding to Stewie in ways that required hearing him. In the simulated episodes where Stewie kills Lois and takes over the world, all the characters respond to him fully. The rules have never been stated and never been consistently applied, and the inconsistency suggests either that the writers stopped caring about maintaining them or that the rules themselves are more flexible in this universe than any fixed explanation could contain. The sixth concerns the recurring character of Death and his operating practices beyond what we examined in the main sections. Specifically, there is the question of where Death goes when he is not collecting souls. He has a mother. He has a social life of sorts. He exists as a person in a world where he is also a cosmic function. The tension between his personal existence and his professional responsibilities has been played for laughs in every episode he appears in, but it points to a genuine philosophical puzzle about the nature of this universe's metaphysics. What does it mean that the mechanism of mortality is a person with feelings and a domestic situation? What does it mean that this person can be incapacitated, can be killed and reincarnated, can be embarrassed and frustrated and lonely? The show has a more interesting cosmology than it ever really committed to developing. The seventh mystery is what the Drunken Clam actually is in the show's universe beyond a bar. It is the men's primary gathering place. It is where the important conversations happen, where the group dynamics of Peter, Joe, and the others are negotiated and maintained. In a show that sometimes operates like a sitcom version of a mythological universe, the bar that serves as the social anchor of the community deserves more examination than it gets. Who built it? Who chose to put it in this specific location? Why does this particular establishment draw these particular men so reliably and so completely? The eighth concerns Chris Griffin's artistic talent. Several episodes across different seasons establish that Chris has a genuine and exceptional gift for visual art. This is not a throwaway character trait. It is demonstrated clearly and acknowledged by characters within the show, and yet the show almost never develops it. Chris's artistic ability sits there in his character profile, accessible to the writers when they need a Chris-specific plot device, and invisible the rest of the time. What would Chris Griffin's life look like if the show were actually committed to this aspect of who he is? What does it mean for a character to contain a genuine talent that the universe he lives in consistently fails to recognize or develop? The ninth mystery involves the episode where Peter becomes a woman briefly due to hormone treatment, and the show explores his experience with a directness that is unusual for its usual handling of gender. What is interesting is not the comedy of the episode, but the moment when Peter expresses a kind of relief or recognition in the new experience that suggests his relationship with his own gender identity might be more complicated than the show's usual portrayal of him would indicate. This is a door the show opened very briefly and then firmly closed. The 10th mystery is the timeline of Meg's abuse and the specific moment when it changed from mild inattentiveness to active hostility. There is no single episode where this transition is clearly marked. The shift was gradual, which is how these things work in real life, but which is also consistent with a specific kind of storytelling choice. Someone in the writer's room made a series of small decisions that accumulated into a fundamentally different treatment of this character. The mystery is what motivated those decisions in the room. Not just the easy answer of ratings and reaction, but the specific thinking that produced a decade-long commitment to this particular direction for this particular character. The 11th mystery is Bonnie Swanson's inner life, which the show has almost entirely declined to depict. Bonnie is married to Joe, has spent years pregnant or with a young child, and has been treated by the show primarily as a prop in Joe's storylines. But in scattered moments, usually when she interacts with Lois, Bonnie demonstrates a complexity and a dry humor and a quiet sorrow that suggests an interior life much richer than the show's interest in her. She is one of the show's most underwritten major recurring characters, and the mystery is not just what her full story would look like, but why the show was so consistently uninterested in telling it. The 12th mystery involves the show's version of God, who has appeared as a character several times. God in the Family Guy universe is a specific, particular, somewhat awkward entity with his own preferences and opinions and an imperfect management of the universe he created. The show's God is not omnipotent in the way religious tradition describes omnipotence. He is more like a very powerful person who is doing his best with a universe that has gotten complicated. This version of God raises questions about the nature of the divine in this universe that the show treats as comedy but that have genuine theological implications. Is the world the way it is because God made it that way? Or is the world the way it is because God is not quite managing to keep up with everything? The 13th mystery is the specific nature of the bond between Brian and Stewie. The show has developed this relationship into one of its most important and emotionally resonant dynamics, but it has never fully explained why these two specific characters, out of all the possible pairings in the Griffin household, became so central to each other. What is it about Stewie's extraordinary nature that draws Brian specifically? What is it about Brian's combination of intelligence and emotional availability that Stewie needed? The friendship feels faded in a way the show never articulates, but that the audience registers. There is something in their connection that goes beyond circumstance. The 14th mystery concerns the show's treatment of its own history through the lens of the network relationship. The show has been at war with its network on and off throughout its run, and various episodes have included thinly veiled commentary on this relationship. Seth MacFarlane's publicly stated frustrations with Fox as a network and his eventual deals elsewhere create a context in which certain episodes that seem like they are just about Peter's workplace frustrations or about characters feeling trapped in situations they cannot escape are actually processing something more specific about the show's creators and their relationship to the institution distributing their work. The 15th mystery is the fate of Meg's possible future as a Russian intelligence asset. We discussed this in the Meg section, but the specific mechanics of it warrant return. Meg was programmed as a sleeper agent. Her activation phrase was uttered in the show's universe. She activated, she was told to be quiet, and then she returned to her ordinary life as though nothing had happened. But the programming that was activated is presumably still there. The network that activated her is presumably still operational. And Meg, carrying this hidden second identity, continues to live in her family's house, attending her school, being treated with contempt by people who have no idea what she actually is. The 16th mystery is the precise nature of the multiverse device's power source. Stewie's interdimensional travel technology requires energy to function. The scale of energy required to open pathways between parallel universes is, in conventional physics terms, essentially incalculable. How is a device that can be held in one hand powering itself through the transuniversal jumps that Stewie takes routinely? The show does not care about this question. But the question reveals something about the kind of universe this is. A universe where the laws of thermodynamics apparently have exceptions, where extraordinary technology can be powered by means that are not explained. The 17th mystery involves the show's relationship to its own timeline at the macro scale. The show began in 1999. It has now been running for over 2.5 decades. During that time, American culture, politics, technology, and social norms have changed enormously. The show has engaged with these changes in various ways, sometimes satirically, sometimes by simply incorporating contemporary references into its universe. But the cumulative effect is a show whose universe contains cultural references from an enormous span of time, all of them treated as equally current and accessible by the characters. What does it mean for Peter Griffin to be aware of a cultural landscape that spans from the 1970s through the 2020s, all of it equally vivid in his memory and equally available as material for jokes? The 18th mystery is Stewie's specific emotional relationship with Brian's death and resurrection. The episode where Stewie uses a stolen time travel device to go back and prevent Brian being hit by a car is one of the most emotionally direct things the show ever produced. Stewie's grief at Brian's loss is total and consuming. His decision to sacrifice his only means of getting home from another time period to save Brian is immediate and without hesitation. This is love, unambiguous and complete. And the mystery is what this love means for Stewie's overall arc. A character who began the show wanting to kill his mother ended up being a character whose deepest love is for a dog. The distance between those two Stewies is enormous, and the show has never drawn the full map of how one became the other. The 19th mystery is the question of what the Griffin's neighbors who are not Joe or Quagmire actually know about their neighborhood. The show's background characters, the unnamed residents of Spooner Street and the surrounding area, are witnesses to an extraordinary volume of inexplicable events. Giant chicken fights, time travel incidents, government interventions, alien visitations, the full catalog of impossible things that happen on and around this street. These background characters presumably have memories of these events. What has it done to them? What do they tell each other about what they have seen? What does it feel like to live next door to a household that is at the center of everything strange in this universe? And the 20th mystery, which is perhaps the most human of all the questions this exploration has assembled, is what Peter Griffin actually thinks of himself when no one is watching. Not the bumbling show-off Peter. Not the reckless Peter who drives everyone around him to frustration. Not the weeping Peter of the occasional emotional episode. The Peter who is alone, sitting in his house in the quiet, who has a moment of genuine self-awareness about who he is and what he has done and what he has failed to do. That Peter, if he exists, has thoughts about his life that the show has never given access to. Thoughts that might be funnier or sadder or more complicated than anything the episodes have ever shown. Thoughts that might explain, if they were ever spoken, why this particular man has been at the center of this particular universe for all these years. What he sees when he looks in the mirror without the joke and without the noise. That Peter, the quiet one, the one who knows things about himself that he cannot say out loud, is the final mystery of this whole enormous exploration. And he is, it turns out, the one who matters most. That is everything we have, for now. 3 hours deep into the mysteries of a universe that was never designed to make complete sense and has spent 25 years proving it does not need to in order to matter. The questions we have asked tonight will not all be answered, because most of them are not meant to be answered. They are meant to be carried, turned over in your mind on a quiet evening. Return to when you catch a rerun of an old episode and notice something you had not noticed before. The Family Guy universe is bigger than any single exploration can map. It is deeper than it looks from the outside, and it is stranger than even the people who made it perhaps fully realized. Thank you for spending this time here. Please subscribe if you have not already, and drop a comment telling me which of tonight's mysteries you are taking with you when you close this video. I read every single one. Until next time. End of script. Channel. Uncle Guy Lore. Topic. 3 hours of unsolved Family Guy mysteries plus theories. Bonus section 6. What the early seasons actually told us. Things we missed the first time. There is a specific reward available to people who go back and watch the first 3 seasons of Family Guy after spending years with the later material. Not the reward of nostalgia, though that is certainly part of it. The specific reward of noticing things that were planted early in the show's run that, at the time, seemed like simple character details or throwaway jokes, but that, in retrospect, read as deliberate architecture. Foundations laid for a building that was never fully constructed. Let us go through the most significant of these planted details and examine what they might have been trying to tell us. The first concerns Stewie's original relationship with death. In the very first season, Stewie's plans to kill Lois are not just jokes. They are detailed, operational, and sometimes nearly successful. There is a version of the earliest episodes where Stewie comes genuinely close to achieving his stated goal on multiple occasions, only to be thwarted by circumstance rather than by any internal reluctance. The show established early that Stewie is not merely threatening, he is attempting. And the reason his attempts fail is not that he lacks capability, but that the universe arranges things to prevent the outcome. Why does the universe prevent it? In later seasons, the answer becomes obvious. Lois must survive because Lois is a main character and main characters do not die. But in the first season, that answer does not feel adequate, because the show had not yet fully committed to its own impermanence. Main characters could, theoretically, still face genuine consequences. The universe's protection of Lois in those early episodes reads less like narrative convenience and more like something the universe itself is actively doing, like something that has an interest in keeping the Griffin family intact. This connects to a detail that the show planted in the pilot and never fully developed: the suggestion that the Griffin family is being watched. Not in a paranoid sense, but in the way that certain stories have an audience built into them, a sense of being observed and attended to that shapes how the events unfold. The Griffins, from the beginning, seem to exist in a space where their lives are the subject of sustained external attention. The cutaway structure, the fourth wall breaks, the way certain events seem almost staged in their timing and resolution, all of it reads, in retrospect, like a universe that knows it is being watched. The second planted detail concerns Brian's drinking. In the very early seasons, Brian's relationship with alcohol is one of his defining characteristics, but it is handled with a specificity that later seasons largely abandon. Early, Brian does not just drink a lot. He drinks in ways that are clearly connected to something he is trying not to feel. There are moments in the first 2 seasons where Brian's drinking crosses from affectation into something that looks more like genuine dependency, and the show treats these moments with a seriousness that it rarely returns to. What Brian is trying not to feel is never explicitly stated, but the early seasons plant the impression of a character carrying something heavy that the booze is helping him not to look at directly. Later seasons turned Brian's drinking into a character quirk and a running gag, losing the specific weight of those early moments. But the foundation was there. Brian has a history, somewhere before the show's beginning, that he is managing through alcohol. The mystery of that history is one the early seasons gestured toward, and the later ones chose not to pursue. The third planted detail is the way Peter's friends initially responded to him versus how they respond to him in later seasons. In the early episodes, Joe and the rest of the group at the Drunken Clam treat Peter's behavior with a mix of affection and exasperation that has a genuine quality to it. They like him. They are sometimes genuinely frustrated by him. But the friendship feels based on something real, on actual shared history and genuine mutual regard. The early Drunken Clam scenes have a texture of real male friendship that the later seasons gradually lost as the group dynamics became more comedic and less emotionally grounded. The specific dynamic in those early episodes suggests that the men on Spooner Street arrived at their friendship through experiences that the show does not depict. There is a shared history implied by the easy familiarity of their interactions, a history of things that happened before the pilot started rolling that gave them a context for caring about each other. The mystery of that shared pre-show history, what they did together, what they went through, what bonds were formed before the audience arrived, is one that the early seasons hint at and the later ones discard. The fourth detail is the specific quality of Meg's relationship with her family in those first few seasons, which, as the transcript-based analysis made clear, was genuinely different from what it became. Early Meg is a normal teenager whose family mostly ignores her. There are moments in the first season, quiet ones, where Peter shows something that reads as actual paternal feeling toward her, where the relationship has a texture of ordinary imperfection rather than active contempt. The show, in its first season, was not interested in cruelty toward Meg. It was interested in the specific sadness of being the least remarkable person in a remarkable family. That original Meg, the one whose problem was invisibility rather than active abuse, contains within her a different set of questions than the later Meg raises. The early Meg asks, what does it mean to be normal in a world that rewards extraordinary things? The later Meg asks something much darker. What does it mean to be punished for simply existing? Both questions are valid, but the first one is more interesting and less damaging, and the show walked away from it. The fifth planted detail is the way Lois's relationship with her parents was handled in the early seasons. In those first few years, the Pewter-Schmidt family was drawn with a complexity that the show would later simplify. Early Carter is awful to Peter but has moments of genuine humanity toward Lois. The relationship between a wealthy, controlling father and an adult daughter who has chosen a life he disapproves of is not played entirely as cartoon villainy in the first season. There is a specificity to the hurt on both sides that early Carter episodes contain, a sense that this man genuinely loves his daughter in the damaging way that controlling parents sometimes love their children, that the later seasons largely replaced with pure antagonism. The early seasons planted a Carter who was a more recognizable kind of monster than what he became, a man whose cruelty toward his son-in-law coexisted with a genuine, if distorted, love for his daughter. The mystery of what happened to that version of Carter, how the more nuanced early characterization gave way to the simplified villain of later seasons, is itself a version of the larger mystery we have been examining throughout this whole exploration. The question of what the show lost as it went on, and where exactly along the way it lost it. The sixth and final planted detail from the early seasons is the one that feels most significant in retrospect. In those first few episodes, before any of the theories and the lore debates and the fan analysis existed, the show was doing something specific and careful with the Griffin family. It was building a picture of a household where love and chaos occupied the same space without resolving the tension between them, where Peter could do something genuinely hurtful and then do something genuinely loving in the same episode, where the family was messy and flawed and real in a way that cartoons are not always real. The mystery that the early seasons planted and never answered is whether that reality was intended to last. Whether the people who made those first episodes were building towards something. Whether the warmth that ran underneath the comedy in seasons 1 through 3 was designed to deepen over time, to become the bedrock of a long-running story about a broken but fundamentally loving family finding their way through the years. We will never know the answer. The show took a different direction. The warmth thinned, the family became crueler, the reset button replaced consequence. And the version of the show that those first seasons hinted at, the version where the Griffin family grew and changed and hurt each other and healed and grew again, remained a possibility that was never realized. But the hint is still there, sitting in those early episodes, waiting for anyone who wants to go back and find it. That is the mystery the early seasons left us. Not a mystery of plot or of lore, a mystery of potential. The unanswered question of what this story could have become if the people telling it had kept believing in it the way they clearly did at the start. It is the most human mystery of all the ones we examined tonight, and it is the one I will carry longest after this video ends. Thank you for watching. Please subscribe, leave a comment about your favorite mystery from tonight, and I will see you in the next one. End of full script. Channel, Uncle Guy Lore. A note on methodology. One thing worth acknowledging as this exploration closes is that the Family Guy universe is a particularly unusual subject for this kind of extended analysis because the show was never designed with the intention of being analyzed this carefully. Unlike a show that was built around a mythology, one with a writer's room that mapped out lore in advance and made deliberate decisions about what information to plant and when, Family Guy accumulated its mysteries through a combination of intention and accident. Some of the contradictions and unanswered questions we explored tonight were deliberate creative choices. Many others were simply the result of a large writing staff working across decades of episodes without a central continuity document that kept everyone on the same page. This matters because it shapes how we should hold the theories we have explored. None of them are canonical. None of them have been confirmed by anyone who made the show. They are the product of paying close attention to a text that was not always paying equally close attention to itself and finding patterns in the gaps. The patterns are real. The questions they raise are real. But the specific answers the theories propose are always interpretations, not facts. What the theories represent, at their best, is not an attempt to find the one true hidden meaning of the show. They represent the natural activity of a mind that cares about a fictional universe, filling the space where the story fell silent. Every detail we examine tonight that raised a question without answering it is an invitation. The show left the door open, deliberately or not, and the fan community has been walking through it for years. The best thing about this particular universe is that its doors are still open. The show is still running. New episodes still get made. And within every new episode is the possibility of a moment that recontextualizes something from years ago, that answers a question nobody realized was still open, that plants a new mystery to occupy the next round of analysis. That is not a bad deal. That is, in fact, the best deal a long-running story can offer. Keep the questions alive, keep the doors open, let the universe be larger than any single account of it. The house on Spooner Street has been doing that for over 25 years, and it shows no sign of stopping. Good night, subscribe, leave that comment. I will read every one.